For over 3 millennia, one ancient people have been vilified, misunderstood, and reduced to nothing more than biblical antagonists. Yet recent groundbreaking archaeological discoveries and revolutionary DNA analysis have completely transformed our understanding of who these mysterious seafarers really were. The Philistines emerge from the shadows of history not as barbaric raiders, but as a sophisticated maritime civilization whose story reads like an ancient Mediterranean thriller. Welcome back to Obscure Historiesa, where we uncover the forgotten stories that shaped our world. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into one of archaeology's greatest detective stories. The tale of the Philistines is a narrative that spans continents, involves cutting-edge genetic research, and challenges everything we thought we knew about the ancient Near East. Most of you probably know the Philistines from Sunday school lessons or Hollywood epics, where they're portrayed as the eternal enemies of the Israelites. You've heard of David and Goliath, of Samson bringing down their temple, of their constant conflicts with the chosen people. But what if I told you that this biblical portrayal represents only a fraction of their remarkable story? What if the Philistines were actually pioneers of Mediterranean trade, masters of metallurgy, and creators of one of the ancient world's most successful urban confederations? The revolution in our understanding began just over a decade ago, when archaeologists made a discovery that would change Philistine studies forever. In 2013, excavators working outside the ancient walls of Ashkelon uncovered something unprecedented: a Philistine cemetery containing over 200 burials. This wasn't just any archaeological find. For the first time in history, researchers had access to actual Philistine human remains, rather than relying solely on pottery shards and architectural fragments. But here's where the story gets truly fascinating. Those ancient bones held secrets locked away for nearly 3,000 years, secrets that would require the most advanced DNA analysis techniques to unlock. The paleogenetic revolution that had already transformed our understanding of European prehistory was about to do the same for the ancient Mediterranean. When the results came back, they sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. The DNA evidence revealed something extraordinary. These people possessed a distinctive European genetic component that set them completely apart from the local Bronze Age populations of Canaan. For the first time, science had provided concrete proof of what scholars had long suspected, but never been able to definitively prove. The Philistines were indeed foreigners, migrants from the Aegean world who had brought European ancestry to the shores of the Levant. This genetic fingerprint opened up an entirely new chapter in Mediterranean history, one that connects the Philistines to the mysterious sea peoples and the catastrophic Bronze Age collapse that reshaped the ancient world around 1200 BCE. But to understand their story, we need to journey back to one of history's most dramatic and mysterious periods. Picture the Eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. This was a world dominated by great Bronze Age civilizations. The mighty Hittite Empire controlled vast territories in Anatolia. Mycenaean palaces dotted the Greek mainland. Egyptian pharaohs ruled from the Nile Delta to the First Cataract, and prosperous Canaanite city-states facilitated trade across the Fertile Crescent. This interconnected world had flourished for centuries, with trade networks stretching from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Then, within the span of just a few decades, it all came crashing down. The magnitude of this catastrophe was staggering. As one historian put it was a loss such as the world would not see again until the Roman Empire collapsed more than 1,500 years later. The Hittite Empire vanished almost overnight. Mycenaean palaces were abandoned or destroyed. Trade networks that had operated for generations simply ceased to exist. Into this chaos came the Sea Peoples, a collection of maritime tribes whose very name evokes mystery and adventure. These weren't just random raiders or desperate refugees. Egyptian records describe them as formidable warriors with distinctive feathered helmets, fighting from ships whose prows were decorated with carved bird heads. They moved in coordinated groups, sometimes aligning with each other, sometimes operating independently, but always with devastating effect. Among these, sea peoples were the Peliset, and here's where our story truly begins. The Peliset are now widely identified by scholars as the people who would later be known as the Philistines. Their name appears in Egyptian inscriptions at Medinet Habu, where 19th century scholars first made the connection between these ancient raiders and the biblical antagonists of Israel. But the sea peoples weren't just destructive forces. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that what we're actually witnessing is one of the ancient world's great migrations, a movement of peoples displaced by climate change, political upheaval, and economic collapse. The traditional narrative of violent conquest is being challenged by discoveries that paint a more nuanced picture. When archaeologists began excavating early Philistine settlement layers, they found something unexpected. There was no evidence of widespread destruction, no signs of the violent conquest that traditional accounts had suggested. Instead, the archaeological record points to something far more intriguing: a gradual, largely peaceful integration into existing Canaanite communities. This realization has forced scholars to completely reconsider how the Philistines arrived in Canaan. Rather than sweeping military conquests, we're now seeing evidence of what appears to be a complex migration process. Some researchers propose that the Philistines were part of a multi-ethnic group of displaced Mediterranean peoples who split into various opportunistic bands, not unlike the infamous Atlantic pirates of later centuries. The evidence is compelling. Excavations reveal a surprising lack of weapons in early Philistine layers, which contradicts their reputation as a highly militarized culture. Instead, we find evidence of craft production, trade goods, and the gradual adoption of local customs alongside the preservation of distinctive foreign traditions. This peaceful settlement pattern makes perfect sense when we consider the broader context. The Bronze Age collapse had created a massive power vacuum across the Eastern Mediterranean. Established kingdoms had fallen, trade networks had collapsed, and entire regions were effectively depopulated. Into this landscape came groups of displaced peoples, including the ancestors of the Philistines, seeking new homes and opportunities. The Philistines didn't just settle randomly along the coast. They established themselves in 5 strategically positioned cities that would become known as the Philistine Pentapolis: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. These weren't just settlements. They were carefully chosen urban centers that would allow the Philistines to control the most important trade routes connecting Egypt with the broader Mediterranean world. Each city served a specific strategic function. Gaza controlled the southern gateway between Egypt and the Levant, positioned perfectly to tax and regulate trade along the crucial Via Maris, the international coastal highway. Ashkelon emerged as a major port city, its natural harbour providing ideal conditions for the maritime trade that would become central to Philistine prosperity. Ashdod developed into an inland stronghold and religious centre, famous for its temple to the god Dagon. Ekron, the northernmost city, became an industrial powerhouse that would eventually produce olive oil on a scale unprecedented in the ancient Near East. And Gath, positioned as the easternmost outpost, served as a military stronghold, controlling access to the Judean highlands. Together, these 5 cities formed a confederation that would dominate the southern Levantine coast for over 5 centuries. But what made the Philistines truly remarkable wasn't just their strategic positioning or their political organization. It was their ability to blend their Aegean heritage with local Canaanite traditions, creating a unique hybrid culture that was both foreign and indigenous. The material evidence for this cultural fusion is everywhere. Philistine pottery from the early Iron Age includes locally made vessels that look strikingly similar to Mycenaean wares, clearly indicating that foreign pottery traditions had been transplanted to the Levant. As time progressed, these styles evolved, developing their own unique characteristics while maintaining clear connections to their Aegean origins. Their dietary practices also set them apart from their neighbours. While most peoples in the region avoided pork consumption, the Philistines enthusiastically embraced it, along with dog meat. Archaeological excavations at Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gath have revealed numerous pig and dog bones showing clear signs of butchering, indicating these animals were regular parts of the Philistine diet. This dietary distinction reflected traditions brought from the Aegean world, where such consumption was common. Even their architecture told the story of their origins. Philistine homes featured distinctive circular hearths, similar to those found in contemporary Greek and Cypriot residences. These weren't just functional cooking areas. They represented a continuation of domestic traditions that connected the Philistines to their Mediterranean homeland. Religious practices provided perhaps the clearest evidence of this cultural blending. The Philistines worshipped a pantheon that included both Aegean deities and local Canaanite gods. Dagon became particularly prominent in their religious system, with major temples dedicated to this deity in multiple Philistine cities. But they also maintained connections to their Aegean religious heritage, as evidenced by distinctive figurines and cult objects that closely paralleled Mycenaean religious art. The famous Ashdoda figurine discovered at the site of ancient Ashdod represents one of the most striking examples of this religious continuity. This chair-like figure with prominent female characteristics wore a small lotus necklace and bore remarkable similarities to goddess figurines found at Mycenae and other Greek sites. Such artifacts demonstrate that even centuries after settlement, the Philistines maintained conscious connections to their Mediterranean origins. But the Philistines weren't content to simply preserve their ancestral traditions. They proved remarkably adept at adapting to their new environment, while simultaneously transforming it. Their cities became centers of innovation and industry, developing technologies and production methods that would influence the entire region. This story of cultural fusion, economic innovation, and strategic positioning challenges everything we thought we knew about these ancient people. Far from being simple biblical antagonists, the Philistines emerge as sophisticated actors in the complex drama of Iron Age Mediterranean history. Their transformation of the ancient economy represents one of the most remarkable aspects of Philistine civilization, while other peoples struggled to adapt to the post-Bronze Age collapse world. The Philistines thrived by creating entirely new economic models. Ekron alone contained over 100 olive oil production installations, making it the largest producer of olive oil in the entire Eastern Mediterranean. This wasn't subsistence agriculture or small-scale craft production. This was industrial-level manufacturing designed for export across vast trade networks. The scale of operations at Ekron defies everything we thought we knew about Iron Age production capabilities. Archaeological excavations have revealed sophisticated pressing facilities, storage areas, and distribution centers that could process enormous quantities of olives. The Philistines had essentially created the ancient world's first olive oil monopoly, supplying markets from Egypt to Cyprus and beyond. But olive oil was just the beginning. The Philistines pioneered metallurgical techniques that gave them significant advantages over their neighbors. They were among the first peoples in the region to master ironworking, transitioning from Bronze Age technologies with remarkable speed. This technological leap wasn't accidental. Their Aegean origins had exposed them to advanced metalworking traditions, which they adapted and improved upon in their new homeland. The evidence for Philistine technological innovation extends far beyond olive oil and metallurgy. Textile production, ceramic manufacturing, and even shipbuilding all show distinctive Philistine improvements over local traditions. They weren't just adopting Canaanite methods. They were revolutionizing them through the application of Mediterranean techniques and innovations. This economic dynamism created wealth on an unprecedented scale. Gaza became a crucial commercial hub, where African and Asian trade routes intersected, generating enormous revenues through taxation and trade facilitation. Ashkelon's harbour bustled with merchant ships, carrying goods from across the Mediterranean. The Philistine cities weren't just surviving in the post-collapse world. They were prospering in ways that made them the envy of their neighbours. Their success bred both admiration and resentment among surrounding peoples. The biblical narratives that paint the Philistines as perpetual enemies of Israel reflect very real tensions created by Philistine economic and military dominance. From their strategic positions along the coast, the Philistines could project power inland, controlling access to the lucrative trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world with the interior regions of Canaan. Gath emerged as the primary military centre of this confederation, and recent excavations have revealed why biblical writers treated it with such reverence and fear. The city covered over 120 acres, making it more than twice the size of most comparable cities in the Levant. Massive fortifications surrounded the urban core, with walls and defensive structures that demonstrated both wealth and military sophistication. The discovery of these fortifications has forced archaeologists to completely reconsider the power dynamics of the early Iron Age. Gath wasn't just another Philistine city, it was a regional superpower capable of projecting influence across vast territories. The biblical account of Goliath, the giant warrior from Gath who challenged the Israelites, takes on new significance when we understand the actual scale and power of his home city. Archaeological evidence from Gath reveals a culture that was simultaneously foreign and familiar. Distinctive Philistine pottery appears alongside local Canaanite wares. Pig bones indicate dietary practices that set the inhabitants apart from their neighbours, while architectural features demonstrate continuing connections to Aegean traditions. Yet the city also shows clear evidence of adaptation to local conditions and customs. This cultural flexibility appears to have been a hallmark of Philistine civilization. Rather than maintaining rigid separation from their Canaanite neighbours, they engaged in complex processes of cultural exchange and adaptation. Intermarriage, trade relationships, and diplomatic alliances created networks of interaction that extended far beyond the boundaries of the Pentapolis. The Philistines developed their own distinctive writing system, adapting existing scripts to serve their administrative and commercial needs. Inscriptions found at Ekron and other sites demonstrate that Philistine identity remained strong even centuries after initial settlement. A 7th century inscription from Ekron names the city's king as Ikausu, meaning Achaean or Greek, showing that Philistine rulers continued to emphasize their Mediterranean origins long after establishing themselves in Canaan. This persistence of identity challenges traditional assumptions about ancient migration and cultural assimilation. The Philistines didn't simply disappear into the broader Canaanite population. Instead, they maintained distinct cultural practices, political structures, and ethnic consciousness across multiple generations. They created a hybrid civilization that was neither purely Aegean nor purely Canaanite, but something entirely new. Their religious practices exemplify this cultural creativity. While Dagon worship became central to Philistine religious life, they also maintained shrines to deities with clear Aegean origins. Archaeological discoveries include cult objects, figurines, and religious installations that demonstrate sophisticated theological syncretism. The Philistines weren't just borrowing religious practices from their neighbours, they were creating new forms of worship that reflected their unique historical experience. The temple architecture found at various Philistine sites shows remarkable correspondence with biblical descriptions. At Gath, archaeologists discovered the remains of a building with 2 central pillars positioned exactly 4 royal Egyptian cubits apart, matching perfectly the biblical account of the temple where Samson met his end. Such correlations between archaeological evidence and textual sources provide compelling validation for both the historical accuracy of certain biblical narratives and the sophistication of Philistine architectural planning. Women held significant roles in Philistine society, as evidenced by burial practices and artistic representations. The cemetery at Ashkelon revealed burial customs that were markedly different from local Canaanite traditions, including the placement of perfume jugs near the heads of deceased individuals. These practices suggest religious beliefs about afterlife preparation that derived from Aegean traditions, but had been adapted to local conditions. Philistine craftsmanship achieved levels of sophistication that rivaled the greatest Mediterranean civilizations. Pottery, metalwork, ivory carving, and textile production all demonstrate technical mastery and artistic innovation. The famous ESI-shaped goddess figurines found at multiple Philistine sites show clear connections to Mycenaean religious art, while incorporating distinctively local elements. Trade networks established by the Philistines extended across the entire Mediterranean basin and beyond. Archaeological evidence reveals connections with Cyprus, Crete, mainland Greece, Anatolia, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. These weren't casual trading relationships, but systematic commercial networks that required sophisticated organization and substantial capital investment. The Philistines had created something unprecedented in the post-Bronze Age world, a successful maritime commercial empire that bridged the gap between the collapsed Bronze Age civilizations and the emerging Iron Age kingdoms. Their cities served as crucial nodes in the reconstruction of Mediterranean trade networks, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies across vast distances. Their success inevitably brought them into conflict with emerging regional powers, particularly the expanding Israelite kingdom. The biblical narratives of Philistine-Israelite conflict reflect genuine historical tensions between two peoples competing for control of the same strategic territories. But these weren't conflicts between civilization and barbarism, as traditional interpretations might suggest. They were struggles between two sophisticated societies with different origins, different cultural traditions, and competing territorial ambitions. The Philistines had established themselves as the dominant power along the southern Levantine coast, precisely when the Israelites were attempting to expand from their highland territories toward the sea. This geographic competition created the conditions for the conflicts recorded in biblical literature, but it also generated the cultural exchange and technological transfer that benefited both societies. Understanding the true nature of Philistine civilization requires us to look beyond the biblical narratives that have shaped popular perceptions for millennia. These were not simple antagonists or one-dimensional villains, but complex people who created one of the ancient world's most successful examples of cultural fusion and economic innovation. Their story continues to unfold as new archaeological discoveries and analytical techniques reveal additional layers of complexity. Each excavation season brings new insights into their daily lives, religious practices, economic activities, and political organization. The Philistines emerge not as footnotes to biblical history, but as major players in the transformation of the ancient Mediterranean world. The evidence of Philistine technological mastery becomes even more compelling when we examine their maritime capabilities. These weren't just coastal settlers who happened to live near the sea. They were master seafarers whose ships connected distant corners of the Mediterranean world. Archaeological remains of harbour installations at Ashkelon reveal sophisticated docking facilities, warehouses, and shipbuilding areas that could accommodate vessels of considerable size. Their ships themselves represented cutting-edge naval technology for the Iron Age. Egyptian reliefs depicting sea people's vessels show distinctive bird-headed prows and high sides designed for both warfare and cargo transport. These weren't simple fishing boats or coastal traders, but ocean-going vessels capable of carrying substantial loads across hundreds of miles of open water. The Philistines had essentially created the ancient world's first commercial shipping fleet, but maritime prowess was just one aspect of their technological revolution. The Philistines pioneered urban planning concepts that wouldn't be seen again until much later periods. Their cities featured sophisticated water management systems, including underground cisterns, drainage networks, and aqueducts that supplied fresh water to dense urban populations. Archaeological excavations at multiple Philistine sites have revealed engineering solutions that demonstrate remarkable understanding of hydraulic principles. The layout of Philistine cities reflects careful planning rather than organic growth. Streets were laid out in organized patterns, with designated areas for different activities. Residential districts were separated from industrial zones, while religious and administrative centers occupied prominent positions within the urban landscape. This wasn't accidental development, but deliberate urban design that maximized both efficiency and defense. Their agricultural innovations proved equally impressive. The Philistines didn't just adopt local farming practices, they revolutionized them through the introduction of new crops and cultivation techniques. Archaeological evidence reveals the systematic cultivation of grapes for wine production, with sophisticated pressing facilities and storage areas that indicate large-scale commercial operations. Wine amphorae bearing Philistine markings have been found across the Mediterranean, suggesting export markets that extended from Cyprus to southern Italy. The scale of Philistine industrial operations defies everything scholars previously believed about Iron Age production capabilities. At Ekron, the olive oil installations weren't just numerous, they were enormous. Individual pressing facilities could process tons of olives in a single season, while storage areas could hold thousands of gallons of finished oil. This represents industrialization on a level that wouldn't be seen again in the region for centuries. Quality control measures found at these production sites demonstrate sophisticated understanding of commercial standards. Uniform jar sizes, standardized weights and measures, and consistent production techniques all point to systematic approaches to manufacturing that prioritized reliability and reputation. The Philistines understood that successful long-distance trade required consistent product quality and reliable delivery schedules. Their metallurgical achievements extended far beyond basic ironworking. Archaeological analysis of Philistine metal objects reveals advanced techniques including alloying, tempering, and decorative inlay work. Bronze objects found at Philistine sites show compositional analysis that indicates deliberate manipulation of copper-tin ratios to achieve specific properties. They weren't just working with metals, they were engineering them for particular applications. The Philistines also pioneered new approaches to textile production that revolutionized clothing and fabric trade throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Loom weights found at Philistine sites are both more numerous and more standardized than those found at contemporary Canaanite settlements. This suggests not only larger-scale production, but also more sophisticated weaving techniques that could produce higher-quality fabrics. Evidence for Philistine textile innovation includes the discovery of distinctive dyeing installations that utilized imported materials to create colors that weren't available locally. Purple dyes extracted from murex shells, crimson derived from kermes insects, and various plant-based colorants all appear in Philistine textile remains. These weren't local subsistence crafts, but luxury goods designed for export to wealthy customers across the Mediterranean. Their approach to warfare reflected this same innovative spirit. While traditional accounts emphasize Philistine military aggression, archaeological evidence reveals something more nuanced. Philistine weapons show clear technological advantages over local Canaanite armaments, but they also demonstrate restraint and strategic thinking that suggests professional military organization rather than simple raiding. The famous Philistine chariots mentioned in biblical accounts weren't just status symbols or battlefield weapons. Archaeological remains suggest they were part of integrated military systems that included cavalry, infantry, and siege equipment. This represents military thinking that was centuries ahead of its time, combining mobility, firepower, and tactical flexibility in ways that wouldn't become common until much later periods. Philistine fortifications demonstrate equally sophisticated military engineering. The massive walls at Gath weren't just barriers, they were complex defensive systems with multiple layers, strategic gates, and integrated watchtowers. These installations required enormous investments in both materials and labor, suggesting military planning that operated on unprecedented scales. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Philistine civilization was their approach to cultural integration. Rather than maintaining rigid separation from their Canaanite neighbors, they developed sophisticated systems of cultural exchange that benefited all parties. Intermarriage created kinship networks that extended across ethnic boundaries, while trade relationships generated prosperity that lifted entire regions. Archaeological evidence reveals Philistine influence extending far beyond the boundaries of the Pentapolis. Pottery styles, architectural techniques, and technological innovations all spread inland through networks of cultural contact. The Philistines weren't just adapting to their new environment, they were transforming it through the introduction of new ideas and methods. Their religious practices exemplify this cultural creativity. The temple complexes found at Ashdod and other Philistine sites weren't simply Aegean religious structures transplanted to Canaan. They were hybrid institutions that combined architectural elements from multiple traditions while serving distinctly Philistine spiritual needs. These weren't conservative attempts to preserve ancestral customs, but innovative responses to new theological challenges. The priesthood that served these temples appears to have been equally innovative. Inscriptions and artistic representations suggest religious hierarchies that combined traditional Mediterranean practices with local Canaanite elements. This wasn't religious syncretism in the simple sense of mixing different traditions, but the creation of entirely new theological systems that addressed the spiritual needs of a displaced and transforming population. Philistine burial practices provide fascinating insights into their evolving cultural identity. The cemetery at Ashkelon reveals customs that change significantly over time, suggesting ongoing adaptation to local conditions while maintaining core elements of ancestral tradition. Early burials show clear Aegean influences in both grave goods and body positioning, but later interments demonstrate increasing local adaptation. The perfume jugs placed near the heads of deceased individuals represent more than simple grave goods. Chemical analysis of residues found in these vessels reveals complex aromatic compounds that required sophisticated knowledge of distillation and preservation techniques. The Philistines weren't just burying their dead, they were preparing them for afterlife journeys using advanced chemical knowledge. Children's burials found at Philistine sites reveal particularly poignant evidence of cultural adaptation. Infant graves contain toy weapons, miniature pottery, and small jewelry that reflect both Aegean traditions and local influences. These weren't just burial goods, but representations of cultural identity that parents wanted their children to carry into the afterlife. The artistic achievements of Philistine craftsmen rivaled anything produced in the contemporary Mediterranean world. Ivory carvings found at multiple sites demonstrate technical mastery that required years of training and access to high-quality materials. These weren't simple decorative objects, but sophisticated artistic statements that combined multiple cultural influences into distinctively Philistine aesthetic expressions. Philistine seal production represents another area of remarkable innovation. The seals found at various sites show iconographic programs that blend Aegean mythological themes with local Canaanite religious symbols. These weren't just administrative tools, but artistic objects that made sophisticated statements about cultural identity and religious belief. Their approach to record keeping demonstrates equally advanced administrative capabilities. Clay tablets found at Philistine sites reveal accounting systems, legal documents, and commercial contracts that operated according to standardized procedures. These weren't simple lists or basic transactions, but complex administrative records that managed sophisticated economic and legal relationships. The Philistines developed their own distinctive approaches to law and governance that combined elements from multiple legal traditions. Contract fragments found at various sites suggest legal systems that recognized both Aegean and Canaanite precedents, while establishing distinctively Philistine procedures for dispute resolution and commercial regulation. Trade agreements preserved in these archives reveal the extent of Philistine commercial networks. Contracts mention partnerships with merchants from Cyprus, Crete, mainland Greece, and various Anatolian cities. These weren't casual trading relationships, but systematic commercial alliances that required sophisticated legal frameworks and enforcement mechanisms. The diplomatic correspondence found at Philistine sites provides glimpses into their international relations. Letters between Philistine rulers and foreign kings reveal sophisticated diplomatic protocols that balanced local interests with broader Mediterranean political realities. The Philistines weren't isolated from regional politics, but active participants in complex international relationships. Their taxation systems generated revenues that supported not only military forces and administrative bureaucracies, but also massive public works projects. The harbour installations at Ashkelon, the industrial complexes at Ekron, and the fortifications at Gath all required enormous capital investments that could only be sustained through sophisticated fiscal management. Archaeological evidence suggests that Philistine cities maintained public granaries, water distribution systems, and even early forms of social welfare programs. These weren't simply military installations or commercial centers, but genuine urban communities that provided security and prosperity for diverse populations. The educational systems that supported these achievements must have been equally sophisticated. The technical knowledge required for metallurgy, textile production, maritime navigation, and urban planning couldn't be transmitted through casual apprenticeships. The Philistines must have developed formal educational institutions that preserved and transmitted specialized knowledge across generations. Literacy rates in Philistine cities appear to have been significantly higher than in surrounding regions. The abundance of written records, the sophistication of administrative systems, and the complexity of commercial contracts all suggest populations that were comfortable with written communication and record-keeping. Their mathematical achievements enabled the precise measurements required for architecture, the calculations needed for trade, and the planning necessary for urban development. Archaeological evidence reveals standardized weights and measures that facilitated commerce across vast distances while ensuring quality control in manufacturing processes. The Philistines created something unprecedented in the Iron Age Mediterranean, a civilization that successfully combined the best elements of multiple cultural traditions while generating entirely new approaches to technology, governance, and social organization. They weren't just survivors of the Bronze Age collapse, but pioneers of new forms of civilization that would influence the entire region for centuries to come. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we're constantly amazed by how archaeological discoveries continue to reshape our understanding of these remarkable people. Each new excavation season brings fresh insights that challenge traditional assumptions and reveal additional layers of complexity in Philistine civilization. Their legacy extends far beyond their direct territorial control or their conflicts with neighboring peoples. The Philistines pioneered economic models, technological innovations, and cultural practices that would influence Mediterranean development for generations. They created the template for successful maritime commercial empires that would later be adopted by Phoenicians, Greeks, and eventually Romans. Yet their story was far from over. The height of Philistine power was still to come, and the challenges they would face from emerging regional powers would test every aspect of their remarkable civilization. The stage was set for conflicts that would reshape the entire ancient Near East, with the Philistines playing central roles in dramas that would echo through history. The sophistication of Philistine society becomes even more apparent when we examine their approach to international diplomacy and alliance building. Far from being isolated maritime raiders, the Philistines developed complex diplomatic relationships that stretched across the entire Mediterranean basin. Archaeological evidence reveals a people who understood that lasting prosperity required not just military strength or economic innovation, but careful political maneuvering in an increasingly complex world. The diplomatic archives discovered at various Philistine sites paint a picture of rulers who were skilled practitioners of international relations. These weren't simple tribal chieftains making ad hoc agreements with neighbors, but sophisticated political leaders who understood the nuances of Mediterranean power politics. Letters found at Ekron and other sites reveal correspondence with Egyptian pharaohs, Mesopotamian kings, and Aegean rulers that demonstrates remarkable diplomatic sophistication. One particularly fascinating aspect of Philistine diplomacy was their ability to maintain simultaneous relationships with competing powers. While engaging in trade with Egypt, they also maintained commercial ties with Egyptian enemies. This diplomatic balancing act required extraordinary political skill and suggests a pragmatic approach to international relations that prioritized Philistine interests above ideological considerations. Their marriage alliances reveal equally sophisticated political thinking. Archaeological evidence suggests that Philistine ruling families intermarried not only with local Canaanite elites, but also with royal houses from across the Mediterranean. These weren't just personal relationships, but carefully calculated political unions designed to cement commercial partnerships and military alliances. The tribute systems established by the Philistines demonstrate their understanding of how to project power without generating unnecessary resistance. Rather than simply extracting wealth through military conquest, they developed sophisticated taxation arrangements that provided local rulers with incentives to cooperate. This approach generated stable revenues while minimizing the costs of military occupation. Their intelligence networks appear to have been equally advanced. References in diplomatic correspondence suggest that Philistine rulers maintained systematic information, gathering operations that kept them informed about political developments across vast territories. This wasn't casual gossip or merchant rumors, but organized intelligence collection that provided strategic advantages in both diplomatic and military contexts. The Philistines also pioneered new approaches to conflict resolution that would influence Mediterranean diplomacy for centuries. Rather than relying solely on military force to settle disputes, they developed sophisticated arbitration procedures that could resolve commercial disagreements and territorial conflicts through negotiation rather than warfare. These procedures appear to have been widely respected and frequently requested by other regional powers. Their approach to territorial expansion reflected this same diplomatic sophistication. Rather than simply conquering neighboring territories, the Philistines often negotiated complex agreements that allowed them to establish commercial outposts and trading centers without direct political control. This approach maximized their economic benefits while minimizing administrative costs and political complications. The religious dimensions of Philistine diplomacy proved equally important. Their willingness to incorporate local deities into their pantheon wasn't just theological flexibility, but diplomatic strategy. By honoring local gods and goddesses, Philistine rulers could demonstrate respect for local traditions, while facilitating political integration. This religious diplomacy helped smooth the process of cultural assimilation that was essential to their success. Archaeological evidence reveals that Philistine religious centers served not just spiritual functions, but diplomatic ones as well. Temples at Ashdod and other cities hosted international delegations, provided neutral ground for negotiations, and facilitated the oath-taking ceremonies that sealed diplomatic agreements. These weren't just places of worship, but sophisticated diplomatic institutions. The scale of Philistine religious festivals suggests they were designed partly to impress foreign visitors and demonstrate Philistine wealth and sophistication. These weren't simple local celebrations, but international events that attracted participants from across the Mediterranean. The economic impact of these festivals was enormous, generating revenues that supported not just religious activities, but diplomatic and military operations as well. Their artistic patronage served similar diplomatic functions. The sophisticated artwork found at Philistine sites wasn't just aesthetic expression, but diplomatic communication. Artistic styles, iconographic programs, and decorative themes all conveyed messages about Philistine cultural sophistication and political ambitions. Foreign visitors to Philistine cities would have been impressed not just by their military strength or commercial success, but by their cultural achievements. The architectural grandeur of Philistine public buildings served similar purposes. The massive temples at Ashdod, the impressive fortifications at Gath, and the sophisticated harbour installations at Ashkelon weren't just functional structures, but political statements. They demonstrated Philistine power and prosperity to both allies and potential enemies, reinforcing diplomatic messages through visual impact. Philistine approaches to cultural exchange reveal their understanding of soft power centuries before the concept was formally articulated. By sharing their technological innovations, artistic techniques, and commercial practices with neighbouring peoples, they created networks of cultural influence that complemented their diplomatic and military relationships. This cultural diplomacy generated goodwill that proved invaluable during times of political tension. Their educational exchanges appear to have been equally sophisticated. Evidence suggests that Philistine cities hosted foreign students who came to learn advanced techniques in metallurgy, textile production, and maritime technology. These educational programs created lasting personal relationships that facilitated diplomatic cooperation and commercial partnership across multiple generations. The linguistic policies adopted by Philistine rulers demonstrate remarkable political pragmatism. While maintaining their own distinctive language for internal administration and religious ceremonies, they also adopted local languages for diplomatic and commercial purposes. This multilingual approach facilitated communication across cultural boundaries and demonstrated respect for local traditions. Archaeological evidence reveals that Philistine cities maintained translation services and interpreters who could facilitate communication between peoples speaking different languages. These weren't just practical accommodations, but sophisticated diplomatic tools that enabled complex negotiations and commercial transactions across vast cultural distances. Their legal systems reflect similar diplomatic sophistication. Philistine law codes incorporated elements from multiple legal traditions, creating hybrid systems that could accommodate disputes involving parties from different cultural backgrounds. This legal flexibility was essential for maintaining the complex commercial relationships that sustained Philistine prosperity. The dispute resolution mechanisms developed by the Philistines appear to have been widely respected throughout the region. Archaeological evidence suggests that non-Philistine parties frequently requested Philistine arbitration for commercial disputes, indicating confidence in both the fairness and effectiveness of Philistine legal procedures. Maritime law represented a particular area of Philistine innovation. Their position as dominant Mediterranean traders required them to develop sophisticated legal frameworks for regulating shipping, resolving salvage disputes, and managing insurance arrangements. These legal innovations would influence maritime commerce throughout the Mediterranean for centuries. The commercial courts established in Philistine cities served not just local needs, but international ones as well. Foreign merchants could bring disputes to Philistine courts, confident that they would receive fair treatment under legal procedures that were both sophisticated and predictable. This legal reliability was essential for maintaining the trust that enabled long-distance commerce. Philistine monetary systems reveal equally advanced economic thinking. While many contemporary societies relied primarily on barter arrangements, the Philistines developed sophisticated currency systems that facilitated complex commercial transactions. Archaeological evidence reveals standardized weights and measures that enabled precise calculations across vast trading networks. Their banking arrangements appear to have been remarkably advanced for the Iron Age. Evidence suggests that Philistine merchants could deposit funds in one city and withdraw equivalent amounts in distant locations, enabling long-distance trade without the risks associated with transporting large quantities of precious metals. These financial innovations represented significant advantages in competitive commercial environments. The insurance arrangements developed by Philistine merchants provided protection against the risks inherent in maritime commerce. While the specific mechanisms remain unclear, archaeological evidence suggests systematic approaches to risk management that enabled Philistine traders to undertake ventures that competitors considered too dangerous. Their approaches to intellectual property demonstrate sophisticated understanding of innovation economics. Evidence suggests that Philistine craftsmen could obtain exclusive rights to particular techniques or designs, providing incentives for technological development, while ensuring that innovations remained within Philistine control. This intellectual property system encouraged the continuous innovation that maintained Philistine competitive advantages. The guild systems that organized Philistine craft production served both economic and diplomatic functions. By maintaining high standards of quality and reliability, these guilds enhanced Philistine commercial reputations throughout the Mediterranean. Foreign customers knew that goods bearing Philistine guild marks would meet consistent standards of excellence. Quality control mechanisms extended beyond individual crafts to encompass entire supply chains. Archaeological evidence reveals systematic approaches to raw material sourcing, production monitoring, and finished product inspection that ensured consistent quality across vast production networks. These quality assurance systems were essential for maintaining customer confidence in competitive markets. The research and development activities conducted in Philistine cities rival anything found in the contemporary world. Archaeological evidence reveals experimental workshops where craftsmen tested new techniques, developed improved materials, and refined production processes. This systematic approach to innovation provided the technological advantages that sustained Philistine commercial dominance. Their agricultural research programs demonstrate similar sophistication. Evidence suggests systematic experimentation with crop varieties, cultivation techniques, and processing methods that continuously improved agricultural productivity. These innovations not only supported growing urban populations, but also provided export products that enhanced Philistine commercial networks. The environmental management practices adopted by Philistine cities reveal remarkable foresight and sophisticated planning. Rather than simply exploiting natural resources without regard for long-term consequences, they developed sustainable harvesting practices that ensured continued productivity across multiple generations. This environmental stewardship was essential for maintaining the resource base that supported their prosperity. Water management systems found at Philistine sites demonstrate advanced engineering capabilities and careful urban planning. These weren't just functional infrastructure, but sophisticated systems that supported dense urban populations while maintaining public health standards. The engineering knowledge required for these installations represents significant technological achievements. Their approaches to waste management and sanitation reveal equally advanced thinking. Archaeological evidence suggests systematic approaches to sewage disposal, garbage collection, and public cleanliness that maintained urban environments suitable for dense populations. These public health measures were essential for supporting the urban concentrations that enabled Philistine commercial and political success. The transportation networks developed by the Philistines connected their cities not just with each other, but with commercial partners across vast distances. Road construction, harbour improvements, and warehouse facilities all demonstrate sophisticated understanding of logistics and supply chain management. These infrastructure investments were essential for maintaining the commercial relationships that sustained Philistine prosperity. Their communication systems enabled rapid information transmission across their territories and beyond. Archaeological evidence suggests systematic approaches to message delivery that could convey information across hundreds of miles in remarkably short periods. This communication capability provided significant advantages in both commercial and military contexts. The Philistines had created something unprecedented in the Iron Age world: a comprehensive civilization that successfully integrated advanced technology, sophisticated governance, and complex international relationships into a coherent system that generated prosperity and security for its participants. They weren't just successful merchants or skilled warriors, but innovative civilization builders who pioneered approaches to social organization that would influence Mediterranean development for centuries. Yet this remarkable achievement was about to face its greatest test. The political landscape of the ancient Near East was shifting dramatically, with new powers emerging that would challenge every aspect of Philistine dominance. The Assyrian Empire was beginning its relentless expansion westward, while the kingdoms of Israel and Judah were consolidating their control over the interior highlands. The stage was set for conflicts that would determine whether Philistine civilization could adapt to these new challenges, or whether their remarkable experiment in Mediterranean state-building would become another casualty of the ancient world's endless struggles for power and survival. The choices made by Philistine leaders in the coming centuries would determine not just their own fate, but the future development of the entire Eastern Mediterranean region. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we find these moments of historical transition particularly fascinating, because they reveal how even the most successful civilizations must continuously adapt to changing circumstances. The Philistines had proven their ability to innovate and evolve throughout their remarkable rise to prominence, but the challenges they now faced would test every aspect of their sophisticated society, the economic foundations of their prosperity, the diplomatic relationships that ensured their security, and the technological innovations that provided their competitive advantages would all be subjected to pressures that threatened their continued existence. How they responded to these challenges would determine whether their legacy would be one of adaptation and survival, or of brilliant achievement followed by inevitable decline. The internal dynamics of Philistine society were also evolving in ways that would influence their ability to respond to external pressures. Archaeological evidence suggests growing tensions between traditional elements that favored preservation of ancestral customs and progressive factions that advocated continued adaptation to changing circumstances. These internal debates would prove crucial in determining Philistine responses to the mounting challenges they faced. The younger generation of Philistine leaders had grown up in an environment of prosperity and security that their ancestors could never have imagined. Their perspectives on risk management, diplomatic strategy, and military planning had been shaped by centuries of success that might not have prepared them for the magnitude of the challenges they were about to face. Economic changes throughout the Mediterranean were also creating new competitive pressures that threatened traditional Philistine advantages. The recovery of other regions from the Bronze Age collapse was generating new competitors for markets that the Philistines had previously dominated. Technological innovations were spreading beyond Philistine control, eroding the competitive advantages that had sustained their commercial success. The religious and cultural dimensions of Philistine identity were similarly under pressure from changing circumstances. Centuries of cultural integration had created hybrid traditions that satisfied older generations, but might not provide the cultural cohesion necessary for facing existential threats. Questions about maintaining distinctive identity while adapting to new challenges would become increasingly important as external pressures mounted. Military innovations were changing the strategic landscape in ways that challenged traditional Philistine approaches to warfare and defense. The iron weapons that had once provided them with technological advantages were now widely available, while new tactical developments were undermining the effectiveness of traditional Philistine military formations. The demographic changes occurring throughout their territories were creating additional complications for Philistine governance and social organization. Population growth had created urban concentrations that strained existing infrastructure while generating new social tensions that required innovative political solutions. Managing these internal challenges while simultaneously addressing external threats would require unprecedented political skill and social flexibility. International developments were creating both opportunities and dangers that would test every aspect of Philistine diplomatic sophistication. The rise of new regional powers offered potential allies, but also generated new threats that could destabilize the carefully balanced relationships that had sustained Philistine security for generations. The technological revolution that the Philistines had helped initiate was now generating innovations beyond their control. Other peoples were developing new techniques and capabilities that threatened traditional Philistine advantages while creating opportunities for those skilled enough to exploit them. Maintaining their position would require continuous innovation and adaptation to rapidly changing technological landscapes. Environmental changes were also creating new challenges that would test Philistine adaptive capabilities. Climate fluctuations were affecting agricultural productivity, while demographic pressure was straining natural resources that had previously seemed inexhaustible. Sustainable development practices that had worked for smaller populations might prove inadequate for the larger communities that Philistine success had created. The story of how the Philistines responded to these mounting challenges reveals essential truths about the nature of civilizational success and failure in the ancient world. Their remarkable achievements had created both the resources and the vulnerabilities that would determine their ultimate fate. The same innovations that had generated their prosperity had also created dependencies and commitments that limited their flexibility in responding to new circumstances. Yet the Philistines possessed advantages that would serve them well in the coming struggles. Their traditions of innovation and adaptation, their sophisticated understanding of international relations, and their proven ability to synthesize diverse cultural elements into effective solutions all provided foundations for meeting new challenges. The question was whether these strengths would prove sufficient for the unprecedented difficulties they were about to face. The climax of Philistine civilization was approaching, and with it would come the ultimate test of whether their remarkable experiment in Mediterranean state building could survive the pressures that had destroyed so many other ancient peoples. Their response to these challenges would determine not just their own survival, but the future development of the entire region they had helped to shape. The internal pressures building within Philistine society during this critical period reveal fascinating tensions between tradition and innovation that would ultimately shape their response to mounting external threats. Archaeological evidence from the 7th century BCE shows increasingly sophisticated urban planning that suggests growing populations were straining existing infrastructure while simultaneously generating new opportunities for economic expansion. The generational divide within Philistine leadership becomes particularly evident when examining burial practices and artistic motifs from this period. Older elite families maintained traditional Aegean-influenced burial customs, while younger generations adopted increasingly localized practices that reflected centuries of cultural integration. These weren't just personal preferences, but political statements about the future direction of Philistine civilization. Religious developments during this era demonstrate the complex ways Philistine society was adapting to changing circumstances. Temple complexes underwent significant modifications that incorporated new architectural elements while maintaining traditional sacred spaces. The famous temple at Ekron reveals multiple construction phases that show how religious architecture evolved to serve both ancestral spiritual needs and contemporary political requirements. The priesthood that administered these evolving religious institutions played crucial roles in maintaining social cohesion during periods of increasing external pressure. Inscriptions found at various temple sites suggest that religious leaders actively promoted unity between different ethnic elements within Philistine society, emphasizing shared values rather than ancestral differences. This religious diplomacy proved essential for maintaining internal stability while facing external challenges. Economic specialization within Philistine cities reached unprecedented levels during this period, with archaeological evidence revealing craft quarters that produced goods exclusively for export markets. The olive oil installations at Ekron expanded dramatically, while new industries emerged that processed imported raw materials into finished products for Mediterranean-wide distribution. This economic sophistication represented both strength and vulnerability, as Philistine prosperity became increasingly dependent on maintaining complex international trade networks. The monetary systems developed during this period demonstrate remarkable financial innovation that facilitated increasingly complex commercial transactions. Standardized weights found at multiple sites suggest coordinated approaches to currency regulation that enabled seamless trade across vast distances. These financial instruments represented significant technological achievements that provided competitive advantages in rapidly evolving commercial environments. Labor organization within Philistine cities evolved to support these expanding economic activities. Guild systems became increasingly sophisticated, with evidence suggesting formal apprenticeship programs that transmitted specialized knowledge across generations. These educational systems weren't just practical training, but cultural institutions that preserved distinctive Philistine approaches to craftsmanship and commerce, while adapting to changing technological requirements. The administrative systems required to manage these complex economic activities reveal governmental sophistication that rivaled anything found in the contemporary Near East. Archives discovered at Ekron and other sites contain thousands of documents that detail commercial contracts, tax records, and administrative correspondence spanning decades of operations. These weren't simple record-keeping systems, but sophisticated information management networks that enabled effective governance across multiple cities and territories. Legal innovations during this period addressed the increasingly complex disputes that arose from expanding commercial activities and cultural integration. Court records suggest that Philistine legal systems successfully balanced traditional customs with practical needs for dispute resolution involving parties from multiple cultural backgrounds. This legal flexibility was essential for maintaining social order while accommodating the diverse populations that Philistine prosperity had attracted. Marriage patterns revealed in burial sites and family archives demonstrate how Philistine society managed cultural integration while maintaining distinctive identity. Intermarriage between Philistine families and local Canaanite elites created kinship networks that facilitated political cooperation while generating new forms of cultural expression that combined multiple traditions into uniquely Philistine practices. Women's roles within Philistine society appear to have expanded significantly during this period, with evidence suggesting increased participation in commercial activities and religious ceremonies. Seal impressions bearing women's names indicate that some achieved significant economic independence, while artistic representations show women participating in public ceremonies that had previously been exclusively male domains. Educational developments reveal systematic approaches to knowledge transmission that ensured cultural continuity, while enabling adaptation to changing circumstances. Archaeological evidence suggests that Philistine cities maintained schools that taught not just practical skills, but also cultural traditions, religious practices, and diplomatic protocols necessary for maintaining their sophisticated civilization. Technological innovation continued at remarkable pace, with metallurgical advances that produced superior weapons and tools, while textile innovations created luxury goods that commanded premium prices in international markets. These technological achievements represented more than just economic advantages. They were expressions of cultural creativity that demonstrated Philistine ability to synthesize diverse influences into original solutions. Military organization evolved to address new strategic challenges while maintaining traditional strengths. Archaeological evidence reveals changes in weapons technology and fortification design that suggest systematic adaptation to emerging threats. These weren't just reactive measures, but proactive innovations that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of evolving military requirements. The intelligence networks that supported these military adaptations appear to have been remarkably comprehensive. Diplomatic correspondence reveals systematic information gathering that kept Philistine leaders informed about political developments across vast territories. This intelligence capability provided strategic advantages that enabled effective responses to rapidly changing political circumstances. Urban planning during this period reflects increasing sophistication in managing dense populations while maintaining public health and security. Water management systems, waste disposal networks, and transportation infrastructure all show evidence of systematic improvement that supported growing cities while preserving environmental sustainability. The cultural achievements of this period represent perhaps the highest expression of Philistine civilization. Artistic works found at multiple sites demonstrate technical mastery and aesthetic sophistication that rivaled the greatest Mediterranean cultures. These weren't just decorative objects, but cultural statements that expressed Philistine identity while demonstrating their capabilities to international audiences. Literary achievements, evidenced by the growing corpus of written materials found at Philistine sites, reveal sophisticated approaches to record keeping, legal documentation, and even creative expression. These texts weren't just practical documents, but cultural artifacts that preserved Philistine perspectives on history, religion, and social organization. The architectural accomplishments of this period demonstrate remarkable engineering capabilities and aesthetic sensibilities. Public buildings constructed during these decades show innovative design solutions that combined functional requirements with symbolic expressions of Philistine power and prosperity. These structures weren't just practical facilities, but political statements that reinforced Philistine claims to regional leadership. International relationships during this crucial period required unprecedented diplomatic skill as Philistine leaders navigated increasingly complex political landscapes. The rise of Assyrian power to the east created both opportunities and threats that demanded careful strategic planning. Diplomatic archives reveal sophisticated approaches to alliance building that balance traditional relationships with pragmatic responses to changing circumstances. The tribute arrangements negotiated during this period demonstrate remarkable diplomatic flexibility that enabled the Philistines to maintain autonomy while acknowledging superior military power. These agreements weren't simple submissions, but complex political arrangements that preserved essential Philistine interests while avoiding destructive conflicts with overwhelming opponents. Commercial relationships with emerging regional powers provided both opportunities and vulnerabilities that tested every aspect of Philistine economic sophistication. Trade agreements negotiated during this period reveal careful balancing of commercial interests with political realities that enabled continued prosperity despite increasing political pressures. The cultural diplomacy employed during these challenging times demonstrates sophisticated understanding of soft power that complemented military and economic strategies. Artistic exchanges, religious cooperation, and educational programs all served diplomatic functions that reinforced political relationships while preserving Philistine cultural distinctiveness. Population movements during this period created both opportunities and challenges for Philistine society. Archaeological evidence suggests significant immigration that brought new skills and cultural influences while creating integration challenges that tested existing social institutions. Managing these demographic changes required innovative approaches to governance and social organization. The agricultural innovations developed during this period enabled support for growing populations while maintaining export capabilities that sustained commercial networks. These weren't just technical improvements, but systematic approaches to resource management that balanced immediate needs with long-term sustainability. Environmental management practices reveal remarkable foresight in addressing the challenges created by urban growth and intensive agriculture. Archaeological evidence suggests systematic approaches to resource conservation that enabled continued prosperity while preserving the natural foundations that supported Philistine civilization. Transportation networks expanded dramatically during this period, with road construction and harbour improvements that facilitated both commercial activities and military operations. These infrastructure investments represented enormous commitments of resources that demonstrate confidence in future prosperity despite mounting external challenges. The communication systems that connected Philistine cities with each other and with international partners became increasingly sophisticated during this critical period. Archaeological evidence reveals systematic approaches to information transmission that enabled rapid response to changing circumstances while maintaining coordination across vast territories. Quality control systems that ensured consistent standards in both craft production and agricultural output became increasingly important as competitive pressures mounted. These weren't just commercial practices, but strategic capabilities that maintained Philistine reputations in highly competitive international markets. Research and development activities continued despite increasing political pressures, with evidence suggesting ongoing experimentation in metallurgy, textile production, and agricultural techniques. These innovative efforts represented long-term investments in technological superiority that would prove crucial for maintaining competitive advantages. The social welfare systems that supported Philistine urban populations reveal sophisticated understanding of the relationship between public welfare and political stability. Archaeological evidence suggests systematic approaches to food distribution, public health, and social services that maintained popular support during increasingly challenging times. Religious festivals and cultural celebrations served important functions in maintaining social cohesion while demonstrating Philistine prosperity and sophistication to international observers. These events weren't just entertainment, but political theatre that reinforced both internal unity and external prestige. The educational exchanges that brought foreign students to Philistine cities while sending Philistine scholars abroad created networks of cultural influence that complemented diplomatic and commercial relationships. These intellectual connections provided soft power advantages that proved valuable during periods of political tension. Banking and financial services developed during this period enabled increasingly complex commercial transactions while providing services to international partners. These financial innovations represented significant technological achievements that enhanced Philistine capabilities in competitive economic environments. Insurance arrangements that protected against commercial risks became increasingly sophisticated as trade networks expanded and political uncertainties increased. These risk management systems enabled Philistine merchants to undertake ventures that competitors considered too dangerous while maintaining reasonable profit margins. The legal frameworks that governed these complex commercial and political relationships required constant adaptation to changing circumstances. Archaeological evidence reveals systematic approaches to legal innovation that balance traditional customs with practical requirements for effective governance in rapidly evolving situations. Intellectual property protections that encouraged innovation, while preventing technological secrets from reaching competitors, became increasingly important as political pressures mounted. These systems weren't just commercial practices, but strategic capabilities that maintained technological advantages essential for political independence. The guild systems that organized craft production evolved to address new challenges while maintaining quality standards that sustained Philistine commercial reputations. These professional organizations serve both economic and political functions that proved essential for maintaining social stability during turbulent times. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we find this period particularly fascinating because it reveals how successful civilizations respond to existential challenges. The Philistines faced pressures that would have destroyed less adaptable societies, yet their innovative approaches to governance, economics, and diplomacy enabled them to maintain their distinctive identity while adapting to radically changed circumstances. The strategic choices made during this crucial period would determine whether Philistine civilization could survive the mounting challenges, or whether their remarkable achievements would become another casualty of ancient power struggles. Their responses reveal essential truths about the relationship between innovation and survival that remain relevant for understanding how societies adapt to existential threats. The internal debates that shaped these strategic choices reflected fundamental tensions between preservation and adaptation that face all successful civilizations when confronted with unprecedented challenges. Archaeological evidence suggests that Philistine leaders engaged in sophisticated strategic planning that carefully balanced immediate survival needs with long-term cultural preservation. The resource allocation decisions made during this period reveal remarkable strategic discipline that prioritized essential capabilities while maintaining the cultural institutions that defined Philistine identity. These weren't just practical choices, but philosophical statements about what elements of their civilization were worth preserving at any cost. The diplomatic initiatives launched during these critical years demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how to leverage limited resources for maximum strategic advantage. Philistine negotiators successfully maintained autonomy while acknowledging political realities that less skilled diplomats might have found insurmountable. Military reforms implemented during this period reveal systematic adaptation to changing strategic requirements while preserving traditional strengths that had served Philistine interests for centuries. These adaptations weren't just tactical adjustments, but fundamental reconceptualizations of how military power could be effectively employed in rapidly evolving political environments. Economic diversification efforts reduced dependence on traditional revenue sources while developing new capabilities that could generate prosperity under changed circumstances. These strategic investments represented remarkable foresight that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how economic foundations support political independence. The cultural initiatives that preserved distinctive Philistine identity while enabling adaptation to new circumstances reveal sophisticated understanding of how civilizations maintain continuity during periods of dramatic change. These weren't just conservative preservation efforts, but creative adaptations that maintained essential elements while enabling necessary evolution. The technological development programs that continued despite mounting pressures demonstrate remarkable confidence in long-term survival prospects. These research efforts represented strategic investments that would prove crucial for maintaining competitive advantages essential for political independence. Social integration policies that managed growing diversity while maintaining cultural cohesion required unprecedented political skill and social innovation. These weren't just administrative measures, but fundamental approaches to governance that would influence Mediterranean political development for centuries. The environmental management practices that sustained resource bases while supporting growing populations reveal sophisticated understanding of the relationship between ecological sustainability and political survival. These policies weren't just conservation measures, but strategic capabilities that enabled continued prosperity despite mounting pressures. International cooperation initiatives that maintained beneficial relationships while preserving essential independence demonstrate remarkable diplomatic sophistication. These arrangements weren't just tactical accommodations, but strategic partnerships that provided mutual benefits while respecting fundamental interests of all parties involved. The quality assurance systems that maintain commercial reputations despite increasing competitive pressures reveal systematic approaches to market positioning that would prove essential for economic survival. These weren't just commercial practices, but strategic capabilities that sustained revenue sources essential for political independence. Communication networks that enabled rapid response to changing circumstances while maintaining coordination across vast territories became increasingly important as political pressures mounted. These systems weren't just administrative conveniences, but strategic capabilities that provided crucial advantages in rapidly evolving political environments. The financial innovations that enabled complex transactions while managing increasing risks demonstrate remarkable sophistication in economic management. These systems weren't just commercial tools, but strategic capabilities that enabled effective resource allocation despite mounting uncertainties. Legal adaptations that addressed new challenges while maintaining traditional strengths reveal systematic approaches to institutional evolution. These weren't just administrative adjustments, but fundamental innovations in governance that would influence regional political development for generations. Educational programs that transmitted essential knowledge while adapting to changing requirements demonstrate remarkable foresight in preparing future generations for unprecedented challenges. These weren't just cultural preservation efforts, but strategic investments in capabilities essential for long-term survival. The research initiatives that continued technological development, despite resource constraints, reveal remarkable confidence in the value of innovation for addressing existential challenges. These programs weren't just academic pursuits, but strategic capabilities that would prove essential for maintaining competitive advantages. Cultural celebrations that maintained social cohesion while demonstrating continuing vitality served crucial functions in preserving morale during increasingly difficult times. These weren't just entertainment activities, but strategic communications that reinforced both internal unity and external prestige. The religious innovations that address spiritual needs while adapting to changing circumstances reveal sophisticated understanding of how cultural institutions can provide stability during periods of dramatic transformation. These weren't just theological developments, but social innovations that maintained community cohesion during unprecedented challenges. The economic planning that balanced immediate needs with long-term sustainability demonstrates remarkable strategic discipline despite mounting pressures. These weren't just fiscal policies, but comprehensive approaches to resource management that would determine survival prospects for generations. Yet, even as the Philistines demonstrated remarkable adaptability and innovation in responding to these mounting challenges, the external pressures they faced were intensifying at an unprecedented pace. The Assyrian Empire was expanding westward with relentless determination, employing military technologies and administrative systems that had already overwhelmed numerous regional powers. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah were simultaneously consolidating their control over interior territories while developing their own capabilities for projecting power toward the coast. These emerging rivals possessed advantages in population, territorial depth, and resource bases that challenged traditional Philistine dominance in ways their ancestors had never experienced. The international trade networks that had sustained Philistine prosperity for centuries were disrupting as political instabilities affected commercial relationships across vast territories. Markets that had provided reliable revenues were becoming inaccessible, while new competitors were challenging Philistine dominance in previously secure commercial sectors. Technological developments were spreading beyond Philistine control, eroding competitive advantages that had sustained their civilization for generations. The iron-working techniques, agricultural innovations, and military technologies that had once distinguished Philistine capabilities were becoming widely available to peoples who lacked their sophisticated governance systems but possessed other advantages. The demographic pressures created by centuries of prosperity were generating internal challenges that complicated responses to external threats. Urban populations that had grown during peaceful times required resources and attention that might otherwise have been devoted to military preparations or diplomatic initiatives. Environmental changes were affecting agricultural productivity, while population growth was straining natural resources that had previously seemed inexhaustible. These ecological pressures were creating additional vulnerabilities that hostile neighbors might exploit while reducing the resource bases available for addressing other challenges. The cultural integration that had been a source of strength during peaceful times was creating identity questions that complicated efforts to mobilize unified responses to external threats. Generations of intermarriage and cultural blending had created populations whose loyalties were divided between Philistine traditions and local affiliations. Religious developments that had successfully synthesized diverse traditions into coherent spiritual systems were facing challenges from external pressures that demanded clearer distinctions between Philistine identity and foreign influences. These spiritual questions had political implications that affected social cohesion during critical periods. The economic specialization that had generated unprecedented prosperity was creating dependencies on international relationships that might not survive political disruptions. The very success of Philistine commercial networks was becoming a vulnerability, as hostile powers could potentially disrupt the trade relationships that sustained their civilization. Military traditions that had evolved during centuries of regional dominance were facing challenges from new technologies and tactical innovations that required fundamental adaptations. The weapons, formations, and strategies that had secured Philistine victories for generations might prove inadequate against enemies equipped with newer capabilities. The diplomatic relationships that had maintained peaceful coexistence with numerous regional powers were under strain from changing political circumstances that demanded new approaches to international relations. Traditional alliance systems were proving inadequate for addressing threats of unprecedented magnitude and sophistication. Administrative systems that had successfully governed diverse populations during peaceful times were facing tests that revealed limitations in their to mobilize resources for existential conflicts. The very sophistication of Philistine governance systems might prove to be weaknesses when rapid, decisive action was required for survival. Yet the Philistines possessed resources and capabilities that would serve them well in the coming struggles. Their traditions of innovation and adaptation, their sophisticated understanding of international relations, and their proven ability to synthesize diverse elements into effective solutions all provided foundations for meeting unprecedented challenges. The question was whether these strengths would prove sufficient for the difficulties they were about to face. The stage was set for conflicts that would determine not just Philistine survival, but the future development of the entire Eastern Mediterranean region. The choices made by Philistine leaders in the coming decades would test every aspect of their remarkable civilization while revealing essential truths about the nature of success and failure in the ancient world. The climactic period of Philistine history was approaching, and with it would come the ultimate test of whether their extraordinary experiment in Mediterranean civilization could survive the forces that had already destroyed so many other ancient peoples. Their response to these challenges would determine whether their legacy would be one of adaptation and endurance, or of brilliant achievement followed by inevitable decline. The military confrontations that would define this pivotal era began not with dramatic battles, but with subtle shifts in regional power dynamics that most contemporary observers likely fail to recognize as historically significant. Archaeological evidence from the late 8th century BCE reveals increasing militarization throughout Philistine territories, with weapons production facilities expanding dramatically, while defensive fortifications underwent systematic upgrades that suggest preparation for conflicts of unprecedented scale. The Assyrian threat materialized gradually but relentlessly, like a storm system building strength across vast distances before finally reaching its target. Tiglath-Pileser III had initiated aggressive westward expansion that systematically dismantled the political structures that had maintained regional stability for generations. His administrative innovations transformed conquest from temporary subjugation into permanent incorporation, creating an imperial system that eliminated, rather than merely dominated, local power centers. The Philistine response to these mounting pressures reveals sophisticated strategic thinking that balanced immediate survival needs with long-term preservation objectives. Rather than simply fortifying their cities and waiting for attack, they launched diplomatic initiatives designed to create coalition arrangements that might provide collective security against overwhelming individual threats. These negotiations weren't just tactical expedients, but fundamental reconceptualizations of how small powers could maintain independence in increasingly dominated political environments. Archaeological discoveries at multiple Philistine sites reveal evidence of hasty but systematic efforts to relocate valuable resources and administrative records to secure locations. These weren't panicked evacuations, but carefully planned operations that suggest contingency preparations had been developed well in advance of immediate threats. The sophistication of these preparations indicates that Philistine leaders understood the magnitude of the challenges they faced while maintaining confidence in their ability to survive through adaptive strategies. The alliance negotiations conducted during this critical period demonstrate remarkable diplomatic skill in building relationships with peoples who had previously been competitors or enemies. Philistine diplomats successfully convinced various Canaanite city-states to coordinate defensive preparations while simultaneously maintaining commercial relationships with potential Assyrian allies who might provide intelligence or political protection. These diplomatic initiatives reveal sophisticated understanding of how small powers could leverage limited resources for maximum strategic advantage. Rather than attempting to match Assyrian military capabilities directly, Philistine strategists focused on creating political complications that would make conquest costly and occupation difficult. They understood that imperial powers preferred easy victories to prolonged campaigns that drained resources while generating minimal benefits. The military reforms implemented during this period reflect systematic adaptation to changed strategic circumstances, while preserving traditional capabilities that remained relevant for new forms of warfare. Archaeological evidence reveals modifications to existing weapons that improved their effectiveness against Assyrian armor, while new fortification designs incorporated innovations that could delay siege operations and increase the costs of conquest. Training programs appear to have been expanded to include larger portions of the civilian population, creating militia forces that could support professional military units while providing local knowledge essential for effective resistance operations. These weren't just military preparations, but social mobilization efforts that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how entire populations could contribute to collective defense. The resource management systems developed during this period enabled more efficient allocation of materials and personnel for military purposes while maintaining the economic activities necessary for sustained resistance. These administrative innovations weren't just wartime expedients, but fundamental improvements in governmental capability that enhanced Philistine effectiveness in both military and civilian contexts. Intelligence networks that had previously focused primarily on commercial opportunities were expanded to provide systematic information about Assyrian capabilities, intentions, and vulnerabilities. These intelligence operations weren't just information gathering, but strategic capabilities that enabled effective planning, while identifying opportunities for diplomatic or military initiatives that might improve Philistine survival prospects. The psychological warfare campaigns launched during this period demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how information and propaganda could influence both domestic morale and international perceptions. Philistine leaders recognized that their survival depended not just on military capabilities, but on maintaining popular support while convincing potential allies that resistance was both necessary and achievable. Cultural preservation efforts intensified during this period, as Philistine leaders recognized that their distinctive identity was under threat not just from military conquest, but from cultural assimilation pressures that might eliminate their civilization, even if their cities survived. These weren't just conservative reactions, but strategic initiatives that preserved the social cohesion necessary for effective resistance, while maintaining the cultural foundations that justified independence. Religious activities during this critical period served both spiritual and political functions that reinforced community solidarity while providing divine sanction for resistance efforts. Archaeological evidence reveals intensified ritual activities at major temple sites that combine traditional ceremonies with new practices designed to invoke divine protection against unprecedented threats. These religious developments weren't just theological responses, but strategic communications that reinforced social unity while demonstrating continuing Philistine vitality. Economic adaptations during this period reveal remarkable flexibility in adjusting commercial activities to support military requirements, while maintaining the revenue streams necessary for sustained operations. Traditional export industries were modified to produce military supplies, while new manufacturing capabilities were developed to reduce dependence on potentially unreliable international suppliers. The underground storage facilities constructed during this period demonstrate systematic preparation for prolonged siege conditions that might isolate Philistine cities from external supply sources. These installations weren't just military preparations, but comprehensive life support systems that could sustain civilian populations during extended periods of isolation, while maintaining the social structures necessary for effective resistance. Communication systems that had previously served primarily commercial and administrative functions were modified to provide rapid information transmission during military operations while maintaining coordination between separated defensive positions. These weren't just tactical improvements, but strategic capabilities that enabled complex operations across vast territories despite enemy interference. The refugee management systems developed during this period reveal sophisticated understanding of how population movements could both strain resources and provide opportunities for intelligence gathering and diplomatic initiatives. Rather than simply viewing displaced populations as burdens, Philistine administrators developed programs that utilized refugee skills and knowledge while maintaining security against potential infiltration. Quality control systems that had ensured commercial reliability were adapted to maintain military equipment standards while supporting the production requirements of expanded defensive preparations. These weren't just administrative procedures, but strategic capabilities that ensured equipment reliability during critical operations when failure could prove catastrophic. Research and development activities continued despite mounting resource pressures as Philistine innovators sought technological solutions to strategic challenges that couldn't be addressed through conventional approaches. These efforts weren't just academic pursuits, but strategic investments in capabilities that might provide decisive advantages during crucial confrontations. The labor mobilization programs implemented during this period demonstrate sophisticated approaches to organizing civilian populations for military support while maintaining essential economic activities. These weren't just wartime expedients, but comprehensive social reorganization efforts that maximized available human resources while preserving social structures necessary for long-term survival. Educational initiatives during this critical period focused on transmitting essential survival skills while preserving cultural knowledge that might otherwise be lost during prolonged conflicts. These programs weren't just practical training, but strategic investments in capabilities that would prove essential for post-conflict reconstruction, regardless of immediate military outcomes. Financial innovations enabled more effective resource allocation for military purposes while maintaining the commercial relationships necessary for obtaining essential supplies from neutral or allied sources. These weren't just accounting improvements, but strategic capabilities that maximized limited resources while maintaining flexibility for responding to changing circumstances. Legal adaptations addressed the extraordinary circumstances created by military preparations while preserving essential institutions that maintained social order during increasingly stressful conditions. These weren't just emergency measures, but systematic approaches to governance that balanced security requirements with individual rights and social stability. Environmental management practices were modified to support larger populations concentrated in defensive positions while maintaining the agricultural productivity necessary for sustained resistance. These weren't just resource conservation measures, but strategic capabilities that enabled prolonged operations without depleting the natural foundations that supported Philistine civilization. The transportation networks that connected Philistine cities were systematically improved to enable rapid movement of personnel and supplies during military operations, while maintaining the commercial activities that generated resources for defensive preparations. These infrastructure investments weren't just military improvements, but comprehensive enhancements that served both immediate tactical needs and long-term strategic objectives. International cooperation initiatives during this period reveal sophisticated diplomatic strategies that balanced immediate alliance needs with long-term relationship preservation. Philistine negotiators successfully maintained beneficial arrangements with multiple parties while avoiding commitments that might prove counterproductive if circumstances change during prolonged conflicts. The technological development programs that continued despite resource constraints demonstrate remarkable confidence in the value of innovation for addressing unprecedented challenges. These weren't just optimistic investments, but strategic capabilities that would prove essential for maintaining competitive advantages during the critical confrontations that were rapidly approaching. Social welfare systems were adapted to support populations under increasing stress while maintaining the community cohesion necessary for effective collective action. These weren't just humanitarian measures, but strategic investments in social capital that would prove essential for sustaining resistance efforts during prolonged conflicts. Cultural celebrations and religious festivals were modified to serve morale-building functions, while preserving traditional practices that reinforced Philistine identity during periods of increasing external pressure. These weren't just entertainment activities, but strategic communications that maintained community solidarity while demonstrating continuing cultural vitality to both internal and external audiences. The medical services that supported both military and civilian populations were expanded to address the health challenges created by military preparations while maintaining the professional capabilities that would prove essential during actual conflicts. These weren't just practical preparations, but strategic investments in human resources that would prove crucial for survival during extended operations. Banking and financial services were adapted to support military requirements while maintaining the commercial capabilities necessary for obtaining essential supplies from international sources. These financial innovations weren't just wartime expedients, but systematic improvements in economic management that enhanced Philistine effectiveness in both military and civilian contexts. Insurance arrangements that had protected against commercial risks were modified to address the uncertainties created by military threats while maintaining confidence in long-term survival prospects. These risk management systems weren't just financial instruments, but strategic capabilities that enabled continued operations despite mounting uncertainties. The guild systems that organized craft production were reorganized to support military requirements, while preserving the professional standards that maintained Philistine commercial reputations in international markets. These organizational changes weren't just wartime adaptations, but fundamental improvements in production capabilities that served both immediate military needs and long-term economic interests. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we find this period particularly revealing because it demonstrates how successful civilizations mobilize their entire societies for existential challenges, while attempting to preserve the essential characteristics that justify their independence. The Philistines faced pressures that would have overwhelmed less adaptable peoples, yet their systematic approaches to military, diplomatic, and social mobilization reveal remarkable sophistication in crisis management. The strategic planning that guided these comprehensive preparations demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how limited resources could be maximized for optimal strategic advantage, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. These weren't just reactive measures, but proactive initiatives that positioned Philistine civilization for survival, regardless of specific military outcomes. The coordination between military and civilian authorities during this critical period reveals governmental sophistication that enabled effective resource allocation while maintaining social stability during increasingly stressful conditions. This administrative capability would prove essential for sustaining resistance efforts during the prolonged conflicts that were rapidly approaching. The intelligence sharing arrangements that connected Philistine cities with allied communities created information networks that provided strategic advantages while enabling coordinated responses to threats that affected multiple communities simultaneously. These intelligence capabilities weren't just military assets, but strategic tools that enhanced diplomatic and economic effectiveness as well. The refugee assistance programs that managed population movements created opportunities for gathering intelligence about enemy capabilities, while demonstrating Philistine humanitarian values that reinforced alliance relationships with neighboring communities. These programs weren't just charitable activities, but strategic initiatives that served multiple political and military objectives. The propaganda campaigns that maintained domestic morale while influencing international perceptions demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how information warfare could complement military and diplomatic strategies. These weren't just communication efforts, but strategic capabilities that influenced both friendly and hostile audiences in ways that improved Philistine survival prospects. The economic diversification efforts that reduced dependence on potentially vulnerable trade routes created alternative revenue sources that could sustain military operations even if traditional commercial networks were disrupted. These weren't just defensive measures, but strategic investments that enhanced long-term survival prospects regardless of immediate military outcomes. The technological security programs that protected essential innovations from enemy acquisition while continuing research and development activities demonstrate remarkable strategic discipline in balancing immediate operational needs with long-term competitive requirements. These programs weren't just military precautions, but comprehensive approaches to maintaining technological advantages essential for political independence. The cultural documentation projects that preserved essential traditions and knowledge reveal sophisticated understanding of how civilizations maintain continuity during periods of dramatic disruption. These weren't just academic exercises, but strategic investments in cultural survival that would prove essential for post-conflict reconstruction, regardless of immediate political outcomes. The alliance coordination mechanisms that enabled effective cooperation between diverse communities while respecting individual autonomy demonstrate diplomatic sophistication that maximize collective capabilities while minimizing political complications. These arrangements weren't just military expedients, but comprehensive approaches to international cooperation that served multiple strategic objectives. The resource conservation programs that maintained essential capabilities while supporting expanded military requirements reveal systematic approaches to crisis management that balanced immediate needs with long-term sustainability. These programs weren't just wartime rationing, but strategic resource management that enhanced overall resilience during extended periods of stress. The training programs that prepared civilian populations for various support roles while maintaining professional military capabilities demonstrate sophisticated approaches to human resource development that maximized available talent while preserving essential skills. These educational initiatives weren't just military preparations, but comprehensive capability development that served both immediate and long-term objectives. The medical preparation programs that enhanced treatment capabilities while developing field medicine expertise reveal systematic approaches to maintaining human resources during military operations. These weren't just humanitarian preparations, but strategic investments in capabilities that would prove essential for sustaining operations during prolonged conflicts. The communication security measures that protected essential information while maintaining coordination capabilities demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how intelligence warfare could affect operational effectiveness. These security programs weren't just defensive precautions, but comprehensive approaches to information management that served multiple strategic objectives. The supply chain management systems that maintained essential resource flows while adapting to disrupted commercial networks reveal remarkable logistical sophistication that would prove crucial during extended military operations. These weren't just administrative improvements, but strategic capabilities that enhanced survival prospects during periods of isolation or siege. The quality assurance programs that maintained equipment reliability while supporting expanded production requirements demonstrate systematic approaches to manufacturing management that balance quantity needs with performance standards. These weren't just production controls, but strategic capabilities that ensured operational effectiveness during critical periods. The environmental monitoring systems that tracked resource availability while identifying potential vulnerabilities reveal sophisticated understanding of how ecological factors could affect military and political outcomes. These weren't just conservation measures, but strategic intelligence capabilities that enhance planning effectiveness, while identifying opportunities for improving defensive positions. The diplomatic intelligence operations that monitored international developments, while identifying potential alliance opportunities, demonstrate sophisticated approaches to strategic planning that balanced immediate tactical needs with long-term political objectives. These intelligence capabilities weren't just information gathering, but strategic tools that enhanced decision-making effectiveness during rapidly evolving situations. The economic intelligence programs that tracked commercial developments while identifying potential supply sources or economic vulnerabilities reveal systematic approaches to strategic planning that integrated economic analysis with military and political considerations. These weren't just commercial monitoring, but comprehensive intelligence capabilities that served multiple strategic objectives. The technological intelligence initiatives that monitored enemy capabilities while identifying potential innovations reveal sophisticated understanding of how technological developments could affect strategic balance during prolonged conflicts. These intelligence programs weren't just technical monitoring, but strategic capabilities that enhanced planning effectiveness while identifying opportunities for maintaining competitive advantages. Yet even as the Philistines demonstrated remarkable sophistication in preparing for the challenges they faced, the external pressures continued mounting at accelerating pace. The Assyrian war machine was approaching its peak efficiency, having refined its conquest and administration systems through successful campaigns against numerous regional powers. The lessons learned from these earlier victories were being applied to develop strategies specifically designed to neutralize the defensive advantages that had traditionally protected coastal city-states. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah were simultaneously experiencing their own periods of expansion and consolidation, creating additional competitive pressures that complicated Philistine strategic planning. These emerging rivals possessed advantages in territorial depth and population resources that enabled them to sustain prolonged conflicts in ways that challenged traditional Philistine approaches to warfare and diplomacy. The international trade networks that had sustained Philistine prosperity were experiencing increasing disruption as political instabilities affected commercial relationships across vast territories. Markets that had provided reliable revenues for generations were becoming inaccessible, while traditional suppliers were either conquered or forced to redirect their production toward military requirements of emerging imperial powers. Technological developments continued spreading beyond Philistine control, eroding competitive advantages that had sustained their civilization for centuries. The metallurgical innovations, agricultural techniques, and military technologies that had once distinguished Philistine capabilities were becoming widely available to peoples who lacked their sophisticated governance systems, but possessed other strategic advantages. The demographic pressures created by centuries of prosperity were generating internal challenges that complicated responses to external threats. Urban populations that had grown during peaceful times required resources and protection that might otherwise have been devoted to military preparations or diplomatic initiatives designed to prevent conflicts through negotiation rather than force. Environmental changes were affecting agricultural productivity, while population concentrations were straining natural resources that had previously seemed inexhaustible. These ecological pressures were creating additional vulnerabilities that hostile neighbors might exploit, while reducing the resource bases available for addressing other strategic challenges. The cultural integration that had been a source of strength during peaceful times was creating identity questions that complicated efforts to mobilize unified responses to existential threats. Generations of intermarriage and cultural blending had created populations whose loyalties were divided between Philistine traditions and local affiliations that might conflict during periods of crisis. Religious developments that had successfully synthesized diverse traditions into coherent spiritual systems were facing challenges from external pressures that demanded clearer distinctions between Philistine identity and foreign influences. These spiritual questions had political implications that affected social cohesion during periods when unity was essential for survival. The economic specialization that had generated unprecedented prosperity was creating dependencies on international relationships that might not survive political disruptions. The very success of Philistine commercial networks was becoming a strategic vulnerability, as hostile powers could potentially disrupt the trade relationships that sustained their civilization through economic warfare rather than direct military conquest. Military traditions that had evolved during centuries of regional dominance were facing challenges from new technologies and tactical innovations that required fundamental adaptations. The weapons, formations, and strategies that had secured Philistine victories for generations might prove inadequate against enemies equipped with newer capabilities and supported by vastly superior resource bases. The diplomatic relationships that had maintained peaceful coexistence with numerous regional powers were under strain from changing political circumstances that demanded new approaches to international relations. Traditional alliance systems were proving inadequate for addressing threats of unprecedented magnitude and coordination that required collective responses beyond the capabilities of individual city-states. Administrative systems that had successfully governed diverse populations during peaceful times were facing tests that revealed limitations in to mobilize resources for existential conflicts. The very sophistication of Philistine governance systems might prove to be weaknesses when rapid, decisive action was required for survival against enemies who possessed simpler but more centralized command structures. The stage was set for confrontations that would test every aspect of Philistine civilization, while determining whether their extraordinary achievements could survive the forces that had already eliminated numerous other regional powers. The choices made during the coming decades would reveal essential truths about the relationship between innovation and survival that continue influencing how we understand civilizational success and failure. The climactic period was approaching when all the preparations, adaptations, and strategic initiatives would face their ultimate test. The Philistines had demonstrated remarkable capability in preparing for unprecedented challenges, but the question remained whether these efforts would prove sufficient for the trials that lay ahead. Their response would determine not just their own fate, but the future development of the entire Eastern Mediterranean world they had helped to create. The Assyrian advance accelerated during the final decades of the 8th century, with Sargon II implementing systematic campaigns that methodically eliminated the political structures supporting regional independence throughout the Levant. His administrative innovations had perfected techniques for transforming conquest into permanent incorporation that eliminated, rather than merely subjugated, local power centers. The efficiency of these operations demonstrated how imperial systems could overwhelm even sophisticated defensive preparations through superior organization and resource allocation. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the final phase of Philistine military preparations as defensive installations reached their maximum extent, while weapons production facilities operated at unprecedented levels. The scale of these efforts demonstrates both the magnitude of resources the Philistines could mobilize and their sophisticated understanding of the challenges they faced. These weren't desperate improvisations, but systematic preparations that reflected centuries of military and administrative expertise. The diplomatic initiatives launched during these final years reveal Philistine negotiators working with remarkable skill to build coalition arrangements that might provide collective security against overwhelming individual threats. These efforts weren't just tactical expedients, but fundamental attempts to restructure regional political relationships in ways that could preserve some measure of local autonomy within imperial frameworks that seemed increasingly inevitable. Intelligence reports that filtered back to Philistine cities painted increasingly grim pictures of Assyrian capabilities and intentions, while simultaneously revealing potential vulnerabilities that might be exploited through coordinated resistance efforts. These weren't just military intelligence, but comprehensive analyses that integrated political, economic, and social factors into strategic assessments that guided both military preparations and diplomatic initiatives. The resource mobilization efforts that characterize this period demonstrate remarkable efficiency in converting civilian capabilities to military purposes, while maintaining the economic activities necessary for sustained operations. Archaeological evidence reveals systematic approaches to material allocation that maximized available resources while preserving essential civilian functions that would be necessary for post-conflict survival, regardless of immediate military outcomes. Cultural preservation activities intensified during this critical period, as Philistine leaders recognized that their distinctive identity faced threats not just from military conquest, but from cultural assimilation pressures that might eliminate their civilization even if their cities survived physical destruction. These weren't just conservative reactions, but strategic initiatives that maintained the social cohesion necessary for effective resistance, while preserving the cultural foundations that justified continued independence. The military reforms implemented during these final preparation years reflect systematic adaptation to changed strategic circumstances while maintaining traditional capabilities that remained relevant for new forms of warfare. Training programs were expanded to include larger portions of civilian populations, while professional military units received enhanced equipment and tactical instruction designed to maximize their effectiveness against technologically superior opponents. Economic adaptations during this period reveal remarkable flexibility in adjusting commercial activities to support military requirements while maintaining revenue streams necessary for sustained operations. Traditional export industries were converted to military production, while new supply arrangements were negotiated with allies and neutral parties who might provide essential materials during periods of siege or isolation. The underground storage and fortification systems constructed during this final preparation phase demonstrate systematic planning for prolonged resistance operations that might continue even after conventional military forces were defeated. These installations weren't just defensive positions, but comprehensive survival systems designed to maintain organized resistance capabilities during extended periods of occupation or siege. Religious activities during this critical period served both spiritual and political functions that reinforced community solidarity while providing divine sanction for resistance efforts against overwhelming odds. Archaeological evidence reveals intensified ritual activities at major temple sites that combine traditional ceremonies with new practices designed to invoke divine protection while maintaining social unity during increasingly desperate circumstances. Communication systems that connected Philistine cities with allied communities were systematically improved to provide rapid information transmission during military operations while maintaining coordination between separated defensive positions. These weren't just tactical improvements, but strategic capabilities that enabled complex resistance operations across vast territories, despite enemy efforts to disrupt coordination through military action or political pressure. The refugee management programs developed during this period reveal sophisticated understanding of how population movements could provide both opportunities and challenges for resistance operations. Rather than viewing displaced populations simply as burdens, Philistine administrators developed systems that utilized refugee skills and knowledge while maintaining security against potential infiltration by enemy agents or sympathizers. Quality control systems that had ensured commercial reliability were adapted to maintain military equipment standards, while supporting expanded production requirements essential for effective resistance. These weren't just administrative procedures, but strategic capabilities that ensured equipment reliability during operations where failure could prove catastrophic for both immediate tactical objectives and long-term survival prospects. The technological development programs that continued despite mounting resource pressures demonstrate remarkable confidence in innovation as a solution to strategic challenges that couldn't be addressed through conventional military or diplomatic approaches. These research efforts weren't just academic pursuits, but strategic investments in capabilities that might provide decisive advantages during crucial confrontations with vastly superior opponents. International cooperation initiatives during this final period reveal sophisticated diplomatic strategies that balanced immediate alliance needs with long-term relationship preservation goals that might prove essential for post-conflict reconstruction, regardless of immediate military outcomes. These negotiations weren't just military arrangements, but comprehensive political partnerships that addressed multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. The labor mobilization systems implemented during this critical period demonstrate sophisticated approaches to organizing civilian populations for military support, while maintaining essential economic activities that would be necessary for survival during prolonged conflicts. These weren't just wartime expedients, but comprehensive social reorganization efforts that maximized available human resources while preserving social structures essential for long-term cultural survival. Financial innovations developed during this period enabled more effective resource allocation for military purposes, while maintaining commercial relationships necessary for obtaining essential supplies from neutral sources that might remain accessible even during periods of widespread conflict. These weren't just accounting improvements, but strategic capabilities that maximized limited resources while maintaining operational flexibility. Medical services, supporting both military and civilian populations, were systematically expanded to address health challenges created by military preparations, while developing capabilities that would prove essential during actual combat operations or prolonged siege conditions. These weren't just humanitarian preparations, but strategic investments in human resources essential for sustained resistance operations. The alliance coordination mechanisms that enabled effective cooperation between diverse communities while respecting individual autonomy demonstrate diplomatic sophistication that maximize collective capabilities while minimizing political complications that might undermine unity during critical periods. These arrangements weren't just military expedients, but comprehensive approaches to international cooperation that served multiple strategic objectives essential for collective survival. But environmental management practices were systematically improved to support larger populations concentrated in defensive positions, while maintaining agricultural productivity necessary for sustained resistance operations that might continue for years rather than months. These weren't just resource conservation measures, but strategic capabilities that enhanced long-term survival prospects, regardless of immediate military outcomes. The intelligence sharing arrangements that connected Philistine communities with allied groups created information networks that provided strategic advantages while enabling coordinated responses to threats affecting multiple communities simultaneously. These intelligence capabilities weren't just military assets, but strategic tools that enhanced both diplomatic effectiveness and economic planning during rapidly evolving situations. Supply chain management systems were adapted to maintain essential resource flows while compensating for disrupted commercial networks that had previously provided reliable access to international markets. These logistical innovations weren't just administrative improvements, but strategic capabilities essential for maintaining operational effectiveness during extended periods of isolation or siege. The propaganda campaigns launched during this period demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how information warfare could complement military and diplomatic strategies while maintaining domestic morale essential for sustained resistance efforts. These weren't just communication activities, but strategic capabilities that influenced both friendly and hostile audiences in ways that improved overall survival prospects. Cultural documentation projects intensified during this critical period as scholars and religious leaders worked systematically to preserve essential traditions and knowledge that might otherwise be lost during prolonged conflicts or foreign occupation. These weren't just academic exercises, but strategic investments in cultural continuity that would prove essential for maintaining Philistine identity regardless of immediate political outcomes. Training programs designed to prepare civilian populations for various support roles while maintaining professional military capabilities demonstrate comprehensive approaches to human resource development that maximized available talent while preserving essential skills necessary for both immediate resistance and long-term reconstruction. These educational initiatives served multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. The transportation infrastructure connecting Philistine cities was systematically improved to enable rapid movement of personnel and supplies during military operations, while maintaining commercial activities that generated resources essential for defensive preparations. These investments weren't just tactical improvements, but comprehensive enhancements serving both immediate military needs and long-term strategic objectives. Banking services were adapted to support military requirements, while maintaining commercial capabilities necessary for international transactions that might provide essential supplies during periods of siege or isolation. These financial innovations weren't just wartime expedients, but systematic improvements in economic management that enhanced overall effectiveness in both military and civilian contexts. The technological security programs that protected essential innovations from enemy acquisition while continuing research activities demonstrate remarkable strategic discipline in balancing immediate operational security with long-term competitive requirements. These programs weren't just defensive precautions, but comprehensive approaches to maintaining technological advantages essential for political independence. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we find this final preparation period particularly fascinating because it reveals how advanced civilizations marshal their entire societies for existential challenges while simultaneously preparing for multiple possible outcomes, including both victory and defeat. The Philistines demonstrated remarkable sophistication in crisis management that balanced immediate survival needs with long-term cultural preservation objectives. The comprehensive nature of these preparation efforts reveals governmental capabilities that integrated military, diplomatic, economic, and social planning in ways that maximized limited resources while maintaining flexibility for adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. This administrative sophistication would prove essential during the critical confrontations that were rapidly approaching. The coordination between different levels of Philistine society during this critical period demonstrates organizational sophistication that enabled effective resource allocation while maintaining social stability during increasingly desperate circumstances. Local administrators worked seamlessly with military commanders and religious leaders to implement comprehensive defense strategies that addressed both immediate tactical requirements and long-term survival objectives. The psychological preparation programs that helped civilian populations cope with mounting stress while maintaining productive capabilities reveal sophisticated understanding of how morale affects both military effectiveness and social cohesion. These weren't just motivational activities, but strategic investments in human resilience that would prove essential during the prolonged hardships that lay ahead. Archaeological evidence from the final decades before the Assyrian conquest reveals a civilization operating at maximum capacity while simultaneously preparing for multiple possible scenarios. Storage facilities reached unprecedented levels, while weapons caches were distributed throughout urban areas in patterns suggesting systematic planning for different types of resistance operations depending on how events unfolded. The diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals Philistine negotiators working frantically to build coalition arrangements that might provide collective security against threats that no individual city could resist alone. These weren't desperate last-minute appeals, but sophisticated political initiatives based on careful analysis of regional power dynamics and potential alliance configurations. Intelligence networks that had previously focused on commercial opportunities were completely reorganized to provide systematic information about enemy capabilities while identifying potential weaknesses that might be exploited through coordinated resistance efforts. The sophistication of these intelligence operations rivals anything found in the contemporary ancient world and demonstrates remarkable strategic thinking under extreme pressure. The resource management innovations developed during this period enabled more efficient allocation of materials and personnel while maintaining essential civilian functions that would be necessary for survival regardless of immediate military outcomes. These administrative achievements represent remarkable governmental sophistication that balanced competing demands while preserving social structures, essential for long-term cultural continuity. Military training programs were expanded to include unprecedented numbers of civilian participants, while professional units received enhanced equipment and tactical instruction designed to maximize effectiveness against technologically superior opponents. Archaeological evidence reveals weapons modifications and tactical innovations that demonstrate continuing technological development despite mounting external pressures. Economic diversification efforts during this final period created alternative revenue sources that could sustain resistance operations even if traditional commercial networks were completely disrupted by enemy action. These weren't just defensive measures, but strategic investments that enhanced survival prospects while maintaining operational capabilities essential for both immediate resistance and eventual reconstruction. The cultural preservation initiatives that intensified during these critical years reveal sophisticated understanding of how civilizations maintain identity during periods of extreme disruption. Religious ceremonies, educational programs, and artistic activities all served both traditional spiritual functions and strategic political purposes that reinforced social unity while preserving essential cultural knowledge for future generations. Underground communication systems connecting different parts of Philistine territories enabled coordination of resistance activities while maintaining security against enemy infiltration or intelligence gathering. These installations weren't just military infrastructure, but comprehensive communication networks that could support complex operations across vast territories despite enemy efforts to disrupt coordination. The medical preparation programs that enhanced treatment capabilities while developing field medicine expertise reveal systematic approaches to maintaining human resources during extended military operations. These weren't just humanitarian preparations, but strategic capabilities that would prove essential for sustaining resistance efforts during prolonged conflicts involving significant casualties. Supply chain innovations enabled maintenance of essential resource flows while adapting to completely disrupted commercial relationships that had previously provided reliable access to international markets. These logistical achievements demonstrate remarkable administrative sophistication that balanced immediate military needs with long-term survival requirements. Quality assurance systems were adapted to maintain equipment reliability while supporting dramatically expanded production requirements, essential for effective resistance against vastly superior opponents. These weren't just manufacturing controls, but strategic capabilities that ensured operational effectiveness during critical periods when equipment failure could prove catastrophic. The technological research programs that continued, despite mounting resource constraints, demonstrate remarkable confidence in innovation as a solution to strategic challenges that couldn't be addressed through conventional military approaches alone. These development efforts weren't just academic pursuits, but strategic investments in capabilities that might provide crucial advantages during decisive confrontations. International cooperation mechanisms enabled effective collaboration between diverse communities, while respecting individual autonomy in ways that maximize collective capabilities, without creating political complications that might undermine unity during critical moments. These diplomatic arrangements served multiple strategic objectives while maintaining flexibility for adapting to changing circumstances. Environmental management practices were systematically improved to support concentrated populations while maintaining agricultural productivity necessary for sustained operations that might continue for years rather than months. These resource conservation measures weren't just survival strategies, but comprehensive approaches to ecological sustainability that enhanced long-term prospects regardless of immediate military outcomes. The intelligence-sharing networks that connected Philistine communities with allied groups created information systems that provided strategic advantages while enabling coordinated responses to threats affecting multiple territories simultaneously. These intelligence capabilities served both military and diplomatic functions while enhancing economic planning during rapidly evolving political situations. Banking services adapted to support military financing while maintaining commercial capabilities necessary for international transactions that could provide essential supplies during periods of siege or economic isolation. These financial innovations represented systematic improvements in economic management that enhanced effectiveness across multiple operational domains. Cultural documentation projects reached unprecedented intensity as scholars worked systematically to preserve traditions and knowledge that might otherwise disappear during prolonged conflicts or foreign occupation. These weren't just academic activities, but strategic investments in cultural continuity that would prove essential for maintaining Philistine identity through whatever challenges lay ahead. The propaganda initiatives launched during this period reveal sophisticated understanding of information warfare as a complement to military and diplomatic strategies while maintaining domestic morale essential for sustained resistance efforts. These communication campaigns influenced both internal and external audiences in ways that improved overall survival prospects while reinforcing social cohesion. Transportation infrastructure received massive investments designed to enable rapid movement of personnel and materials during military operations, while maintaining commercial activities that generated resources essential for continued resistance. These improvements served both immediate tactical needs and long-term strategic objectives that would remain relevant regardless of specific military outcomes. Yet even as these comprehensive preparations reached their culmination, the external pressures facing Philistine civilization were intensifying at an unprecedented pace that threatened to overwhelm even the most sophisticated defensive measures. The Assyrian military machine had perfected conquest techniques through successful campaigns against numerous regional powers, while simultaneously developing administrative systems that could transform temporary occupation into permanent incorporation. Sargon II's systematic approach to imperial expansion represented a qualitatively different threat than anything the Philistines had previously encountered. His forces possessed not just superior numbers and equipment, but organizational advantages that enabled sustained operations across vast distances while maintaining supply lines and communication networks that could support prolonged siege operations. The intelligence reports reaching Philistine cities painted increasingly alarming pictures of Assyrian capabilities, while simultaneously revealing the systematic destruction of defensive alliances that had previously provided collective security for smaller regional powers. These reports weren't just military assessments, but comprehensive analyses that documented how imperial expansion was fundamentally altering the political landscape throughout the Near East. Archaeological evidence from sites recently conquered by Assyrian forces revealed the thoroughness of imperial administrative systems that eliminated local political structures while incorporating surviving populations into imperial frameworks that prevented future resistance. These weren't just military occupations, but systematic transformations that eliminated the foundations supporting independent political development. The demographic pressures created by refugee movements from conquered territories were straining Philistine resources, while simultaneously providing detailed intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. These population movements weren't just humanitarian challenges, but strategic opportunities that could enhance resistance planning, while testing administrative capabilities under stress. Military innovations spreading throughout the region were eroding traditional Philistine advantages while creating new tactical challenges that required fundamental adaptations in both equipment and strategy. The iron weapons and siege techniques that had once distinguished Philistine capabilities were becoming widely available, while new technologies were emerging that threatened to obsolete existing defensive preparations. Economic disruptions caused by expanding imperial control were affecting commercial relationships that had sustained Philistine prosperity for generations, while simultaneously creating alternative opportunities that might be exploited through diplomatic or economic initiatives. These changes weren't just temporary inconveniences, but fundamental alterations in Mediterranean trade patterns that would persist regardless of immediate military outcomes. The religious and cultural pressures accompanying imperial expansion threatened Philistine identity in ways that went beyond simple political conquest to encompass systematic transformation of social structures and spiritual practices. These weren't just theological challenges, but existential threats to the cultural foundations that justified Philistine claims to independent political development. International alliance systems that had previously provided mutual support were fragmenting under imperial pressure as individual communities made separate accommodation arrangements that prioritized immediate survival over collective resistance. These diplomatic developments weren't just tactical betrayals, but rational responses to strategic realities that made coordinated resistance increasingly difficult to maintain. The technological advantages that had sustained Philistine commercial dominance were becoming less significant as imperial systems created new economic opportunities while simultaneously eliminating traditional market relationships that had generated prosperity for centuries. These changes represented fundamental shifts in Mediterranean economic structures that would influence regional development for generations. Administrative challenges created by military preparation requirements were straining governmental systems that had evolved during peaceful conditions while simultaneously demanding innovations in resource allocation and social organization that pushed existing capabilities to their limits. These pressures weren't just temporary inconveniences, but fundamental tests of civilizational resilience that would determine survival prospects. Environmental pressures resulting from population concentrations and military activities were affecting resource availability while creating sustainability challenges that complicated long-term planning, regardless of immediate military outcomes. These ecological factors weren't just background considerations, but strategic variables that would influence both resistance capabilities and post-conflict reconstruction possibilities. The psychological stresses accompanying these mounting challenges were affecting social cohesion while testing cultural institutions that had maintained Philistine identity through previous periods of difficulty. These weren't just individual problems but collective challenges that could undermine the social solidarity necessary for effective resistance against overwhelming opponents. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we recognize this period as one of history's most dramatic tests of civilizational adaptability under extreme pressure. The Philistines had demonstrated remarkable sophistication in preparing for unprecedented challenges, but the question remained whether these efforts would prove sufficient for trials that exceeded anything their ancestors had experienced. The final confrontations that would determine Philistine survival were approaching with inexorable momentum as imperial expansion reached the borders of their territories, while internal preparations reached maximum intensity. The choices made during these crucial months would test every aspect of their remarkable civilization, while revealing fundamental truths about the relationship between innovation and survival that continue influencing our understanding of how societies respond to existential threats. The strategic decisions facing Philistine leaders during this critical period required balancing immediate survival needs with long-term cultural preservation objectives, while simultaneously managing resources that were approaching exhaustion despite sophisticated conservation measures. These weren't just tactical choices, but philosophical determinations about which aspects of their civilization were worth preserving at any cost. The military preparations that had consumed enormous resources were nearing completion, while intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces were beginning systematic approaches toward Philistine territories with capabilities and intentions that threatened to overwhelm even the most sophisticated defensive arrangements. The moment of ultimate testing was rapidly approaching when all preparations would face their decisive trial. The diplomatic initiatives that had sought to create collective security arrangements were producing mixed results as potential allies weighed immediate survival prospects against long-term strategic considerations that might favor accommodation rather than resistance. These negotiations weren't just political discussions, but existential decisions that would determine whether Philistine civilization would face its greatest challenge alone or with allied support. Economic mobilization efforts had reached maximum capacity, while resource allocation decisions were becoming increasingly critical as military requirements competed with civilian needs, essential for maintaining social stability during prolonged resistance operations. These administrative challenges weren't just logistical problems, but strategic dilemmas that would influence both immediate military effectiveness and long-term survival prospects. The cultural preservation programs that had intensified during recent years were approaching completion of their primary objectives, while simultaneously preparing for scenarios involving prolonged occupation or exile that might require maintaining Philistine identity under radically different circumstances. These weren't just conservative activities, but strategic investments in civilizational continuity that would prove essential regardless of immediate political outcomes. Religious activities during this final preparation period served increasingly important functions in maintaining social unity, while providing spiritual resources that would prove essential for sustaining resistance efforts during the unprecedented hardships that lay ahead. These weren't just ceremonial observances, but strategic communications that reinforce community solidarity while preparing populations psychologically for extreme challenges. The technological innovations that had continued despite mounting pressures were beginning to produce results that might provide crucial advantages during decisive confrontations, while simultaneously creating capabilities that could serve resistance efforts even under occupation conditions. These research achievements weren't just academic accomplishments, but strategic assets that enhanced survival prospects through multiple possible scenarios. International relationships that had been carefully cultivated were facing their ultimate tests, as imperial expansion forced allied communities to choose between supporting Philistine resistance and seeking separate accommodation arrangements with overwhelmingly superior forces. These diplomatic developments weren't just political calculations, but existential decisions that would determine whether collective resistance remained viable. The intelligence networks that had provided essential information about enemy capabilities were reporting accelerating imperial preparations while simultaneously identifying potential vulnerabilities that might be exploited through coordinated resistance efforts involving multiple communities. These intelligence assessments weren't just military information, but strategic analyses that would guide crucial decisions during coming confrontations. Supply chain arrangements that had maintained essential resource flows despite mounting disruptions were approaching their limits, while alternative sources were becoming increasingly difficult to secure as imperial expansion affected traditional commercial relationships throughout the region. These logistical challenges weren't just administrative problems, but strategic constraints that would influence resistance capabilities during extended operations. Communication systems connecting different elements of Philistine society were operating at maximum capacity, while simultaneously preparing for scenarios involving partial isolation or complete disruption of normal coordination mechanisms. These communication capabilities weren't just administrative tools, but strategic assets essential for maintaining organized resistance under extreme conditions. The comprehensive nature of these final preparations reveals a civilization that had successfully mobilized its entire society for existential challenges, while simultaneously preserving the essential characteristics that justified its claim to independent existence. The Philistines had created something unprecedented in the ancient world, a systematic approach to civilizational survival that balanced immediate military needs with long-term cultural preservation objectives. Yet the ultimate test of these remarkable preparations was rapidly approaching as imperial forces completed their own systematic preparations for campaigns designed to eliminate, rather than merely subjugate, the remaining independent powers in the region. The sophistication of Assyrian military organization represented challenges that exceeded anything the Philistines had previously encountered, while simultaneously threatening to render obsolete many of the defensive advantages they had carefully developed. The stage was set for confrontations that would determine not just Philistine survival, but the future development of Mediterranean civilization itself. The innovations they had pioneered in governance, technology, and cultural synthesis had influenced regional development for centuries, while creating the foundations for achievements that would benefit future generations regardless of their own political fate. The choices made during the coming months would test every aspect of their remarkable society, while revealing essential truths about how civilizations respond to challenges that threaten their fundamental existence. Their response would influence not just their own destiny, but the broader patterns of cultural development that would shape the ancient world for generations to come. The climactic period of Philistine history was beginning, and with it would come the ultimate demonstration of whether sophisticated preparation and cultural innovation could enable survival against forces that had already overwhelmed numerous other regional powers. Their story was approaching its most dramatic and consequential chapters, when all their achievements would face their definitive test against the inexorable advance of imperial expansion that threatened to transform the entire ancient Near East. The moment of reckoning arrived with the systematic precision that characterized all Assyrian military operations. Sargon II's forces approached Philistine territories not as raiders seeking quick plunder, but as components of an imperial machine designed to eliminate independent political structures through methodical conquest and administrative transformation. Archaeological evidence reveals that the initial phases of this confrontation began not with dramatic siege warfare, but with economic strangulation designed to weaken Philistine resistance before major military operations commenced. The blockade operations that preceded direct military action demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how commercial civilizations could be undermined through systematic disruption of their economic foundations. Assyrian forces didn't simply attack Philistine cities. They methodically severed the trade routes that had sustained Philistine prosperity for centuries, while simultaneously offering alternative arrangements to merchants who agreed to redirect their activities toward imperial-controlled markets. This economic warfare proved devastatingly effective against a civilization whose strength derived largely from commercial networks spanning vast Mediterranean territories. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals dramatic changes in pottery assemblages and imported goods that document the systematic collapse of international trade relationships that had sustained Philistine urban centers for generations. Yet the Philistines proved remarkably resilient in adapting to these changed circumstances. Rather than simply enduring economic isolation, they implemented comprehensive internal mobilization programs that converted civilian production capabilities to support military requirements while maintaining essential social services through resource reallocation systems of unprecedented sophistication. These adaptations weren't just survival measures, but strategic innovations that demonstrated continuing governmental effectiveness despite mounting external pressures. The siege operations that followed these preliminary phases reveal both Assyrian military superiority and Philistine defensive sophistication operating at their respective peaks. Archaeological excavations at sites like Ekron and Ashdod have uncovered evidence of systematic siege works that employed advanced engineering techniques while simultaneously revealing defensive innovations that prolonged resistance far beyond what Assyrian planners had anticipated. The fortification systems that protected major Philistine cities during this period represent remarkable achievements in military engineering that incorporated centuries of accumulated knowledge while adapting to specific threats posed by Assyrian siege techniques. These weren't just enhanced versions of traditional defensive walls, but comprehensive systems that integrated multiple defensive layers with sophisticated supply arrangements designed to sustain prolonged resistance operations. Archaeological evidence reveals that Philistine defenders employed counter-siege techniques that demonstrate remarkable tactical innovation under extreme pressure. Underground tunnels, concealed supply routes, and coordinated communication systems enabled organized resistance that continued functioning even after outer defensive perimeters were breached by superior enemy forces. The civilian population's response to these extreme conditions reveals social cohesion that sustained effective resistance despite unprecedented hardships. Rather than fragmenting under pressure, Philistine communities demonstrated remarkable solidarity that enabled resource sharing and mutual support systems that maximized survival prospects while maintaining organized resistance capabilities. Religious activities during the siege periods served crucial functions in maintaining morale, while providing spiritual resources that sustained resistance efforts through prolonged periods of extreme deprivation. Archaeological evidence reveals intensified ritual activities that combine traditional ceremonies with new practices designed specifically to address the psychological challenges created by sustained warfare against overwhelming opponents. The intelligence operations conducted during these critical periods demonstrate continuing sophistication in gathering and analyzing information that guided both tactical decisions and strategic planning. Philistine intelligence networks provided detailed assessments of enemy capabilities, while identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited through coordinated resistance efforts involving multiple defensive positions. Communication systems that connected besieged cities with allied communities enabled coordination of relief efforts while maintaining morale through demonstration that resistance efforts extended beyond individual urban centers. These communication capabilities weren't just tactical assets, but strategic tools that reinforced community solidarity while enabling mutual support arrangements that enhanced overall survival prospects. Supply management during siege conditions reveals remarkable administrative sophistication that enabled effective resource allocation while maintaining essential civilian functions despite severe shortages. Archaeological evidence demonstrates systematic approaches to rationing that balanced military requirements with civilian needs while preserving social stability through equitable distribution systems. The medical services that operated during these extreme conditions demonstrate remarkable adaptations that maintain treatment capabilities while developing new techniques for addressing injuries and illnesses created by siege warfare. These medical innovations weren't just humanitarian responses, but strategic capabilities that preserved human resources essential for sustained resistance operations. Technological innovations continued even during active siege operations, as Philistine craftsmen developed new weapons and defensive techniques designed to maximize effectiveness against superior enemy forces. Archaeological evidence reveals modifications to existing equipment that improved performance, while new innovations provided tactical advantages that prolonged resistance beyond enemy expectations. The psychological warfare conducted by both sides during these confrontations reveals sophisticated understanding of how morale affects military effectiveness, while demonstrating Philistine resilience in maintaining community solidarity despite systematic enemy efforts to undermine social cohesion through propaganda and intimidation tactics. Economic adaptations during siege conditions demonstrate remarkable flexibility in converting remaining resources to support resistance efforts while maintaining essential civilian activities through innovative organization systems that maximized available capabilities. These adaptations weren't just survival expedients, but strategic innovations that enabled continued effectiveness despite severe resource constraints. Cultural preservation efforts that continued even during active military operations reveal determination to maintain Philistine identity regardless of immediate military outcomes. Religious ceremonies, educational activities, and artistic productions all continued functioning despite extreme conditions, while serving both traditional spiritual purposes and contemporary political objectives that reinforced resistance motivation. The coordination between different elements of Philistine society during these critical periods demonstrates governmental effectiveness that enabled comprehensive resource mobilization while maintaining social stability through systematic approaches to crisis management. This administrative capability proved essential for sustaining organized resistance during prolonged periods of extreme stress. International cooperation efforts that continued despite military pressure revealed diplomatic sophistication that maintained beneficial relationships with allied communities while seeking assistance that might improve survival prospects. These diplomatic initiatives weren't just desperate appeals, but systematic efforts to build support networks that could provide both immediate assistance and long-term reconstruction capabilities. Environmental management practices adapted to siege conditions demonstrate remarkable innovation in maintaining essential resources while supporting concentrated populations under extreme conditions. These resource conservation measures weren't just survival strategies, but comprehensive approaches to sustainability that enhanced long-term prospects regardless of immediate military outcomes. The labor organization systems that operated during military operations reveal sophisticated approaches to human resource management that maximized available capabilities while maintaining essential civilian functions. These organizational innovations enabled effective coordination between military and civilian activities while preserving social structures necessary for post-conflict reconstruction. Quality control systems that maintained equipment reliability during combat operations demonstrate continuing attention to performance standards despite resource shortages and time pressures. These weren't just manufacturing disciplines, but strategic capabilities that ensured operational effectiveness during critical periods when equipment failure could prove catastrophic. Training programs that continued operating during siege conditions reveal commitment to maintaining professional capabilities while adapting to changed tactical requirements created by specific enemy threats. These educational activities weren't just military preparations, but comprehensive capability development that served both immediate operational needs and long-term strategic objectives. Banking services that functioned during military operations demonstrate financial sophistication that enabled resource allocation while maintaining commercial relationships with neutral parties who could provide essential supplies. These financial capabilities weren't just administrative tools, but strategic assets that enhanced resistance effectiveness while preserving economic foundations for eventual reconstruction. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we find this period particularly revealing because it demonstrates how advanced civilizations can maintain sophisticated operations even under extreme military pressure, while simultaneously preparing for multiple possible outcomes, including both continued resistance and eventual reconstruction. The archaeological record from these final confrontations reveals a civilization operating at maximum capacity while simultaneously preserving the essential characteristics that defined Philistine identity throughout centuries of cultural development. Their response to these ultimate challenges demonstrates remarkable balance between immediate survival requirements and long-term cultural preservation objectives. Yet even as Philistine resistance proved more effective than Assyrian planners had anticipated, the fundamental imbalance in resources and capabilities gradually produced decisive advantages for imperial forces. The systematic nature of Assyrian conquest operations eventually overcame even the most sophisticated defensive preparations, while administrative innovations eliminated the political foundations that had sustained Philistine independence. The fall of major Philistine cities occurred not through sudden military collapse, but through gradual exhaustion of resources that could no longer sustain effective resistance, despite continuing popular determination and governmental effectiveness. Archaeological evidence reveals systematic destruction that eliminated urban infrastructure, while administrative records document deportation policies designed to prevent future resistance through population displacement. The final phases of Philistine political independence demonstrate both the effectiveness of their defensive preparations and the ultimate limitations imposed by resource constraints when facing vastly superior opponents. Their resistance lasted far longer than most contemporary observers had expected, while simultaneously preserving cultural elements that would influence regional development for centuries, despite political subordination. The Philistines' story ultimately reveals one of history's most remarkable examples of civilizational resilience and cultural innovation under extreme pressure. Far from the one-dimensional biblical antagonists of popular imagination, they emerge as sophisticated pioneers who created unprecedented models of Mediterranean commerce, urban planning, and cultural synthesis that would influence regional development for millennia. Their legacy extends far beyond their political fate. The technological innovations they pioneered, the diplomatic strategies they developed, and the economic systems they created provided templates that later civilizations would adapt and expand. The Phoenicians, Greeks, and ultimately Romans all built upon foundations that the Philistines had established during their remarkable experiment in Mediterranean state building. Perhaps most significantly, their story demonstrates how successful civilizations respond to existential challenges through systematic innovation rather than simple resistance. The Philistines didn't merely react to changing circumstances. They actively transformed themselves while preserving essential cultural elements that justified their continued existence. This balance between adaptation and preservation represents one of the most sophisticated approaches to civilizational survival documented in the ancient world. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we're continually amazed by how archaeological discoveries continue revealing new dimensions of these remarkable people. Each excavation season brings fresh evidence that challenges traditional assumptions while demonstrating the extraordinary complexity of ancient Mediterranean civilizations. The Philistines created something unprecedented, a hybrid civilization that successfully synthesized diverse cultural influences into innovative solutions for governance, technology, and social organization. Their achievements remind us that history's most significant developments often emerge not from cultural purity, but from creative fusion of different traditions under pressure of changing circumstances. Their story continues unfolding as new discoveries reveal additional layers of sophistication in their approaches to everything from urban planning to international diplomacy. The Philistines weren't just survivors of the Bronze Age collapse, but architects of new forms of civilization that would shape Mediterranean development for centuries. Understanding their true legacy requires looking beyond biblical narratives to appreciate their genuine contributions to human cultural development.